Icon Audio Arts. What follows are glimpses of the book with which luck and perseverance will one day become my autobiography. Right now, these are only passages of time I experienced long ago, as filtered through my current conscious state. Herein are roughly the first 3 chapters of my story, in a much abbreviated fashion, as well as a few kind words from friends and the varied appendices of writing by others about myself over the years. I have released this ambitious teaser ahead of the real deal for 2 reasons. 1. I found a great little studio around the corner from the Gaudiya Math ashram in which I'm staying in Vrindavan circa 2019 on pilgrimage battery recharge mode. This then gave me something to do afternoons other than continuing my now 50-year practice of calling on Krishna via the Hare Krishna mantra, eating pizza at Govinda's, or drinking chai with the jolly shop owners at their various emporiums and Loy Bazaar. So in short, I did it simply, as the old dirty joke goes, because I could. 2. Writing about one's life, no matter who you are, is often painful and always dreadfully misogynistic. It's a hard slog, but as my son Eden Garrett Giuliano is now 11, and I am quite a bit older, I thought he might one day be interested in knowing how his dad became his dad. Now, whether that might occur in the form of a proper 100,000-word trade autobiography is still up for grabs. So in deference to my dwindling time and stamina, I thought it would be smart to push at least something out that might approximate the tremendous job at hand, at least in miniature. Eden would then have something, even if the big enchilada never quite squirted out of my now unarguably aged brain. So that's it. Honestly, it has very little to do with the current listener, but I suffered mightily to produce even the little you have here. Now it's your turn. Bad words. Rough mix. Recollections of a rock on tour. Geoffrey Giuliano in Twilight. Introduction by Timothy Leary. 1 is not enough. 2 is too many. The Incarnations of Geoffrey Giuliano Jagannath Das. What can you really say about the rabid, double-headed monster that is Geoffrey Giuliano and Jagannath Das? He is as divine and exalted as he is mundane and annoying. He is as persistent as he is ambitious, but with the stout heart of a good devotee. He feeds the poor in India, and his wife Vrinda will slow walk you to death's door if he owes you even a few bucks. I once described him as a very large polar bear in a very small igloo. He is a mass of intriguing contradictions and subtle inspiration in the body of a linebacker. As we rode together in the limo from his agent's office in Midtown Manhattan to JFK, he quietly chants the mantra given to him by his guru, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. I reach over and pat his leg. He is a sweet man. He is a terrible monster. A keen conversationalist and a thoughtful yogi. He brought me to New York to do a book on the history of psychedelia. We didn't get the deal, but I showed him the beauty of the cracks in the sidewalk on Broadway, and he made me laugh more than most. Giuliano Dasa is a powerful medicine, but only to be taken in very small doses. At the end of a very long day together, I sit on the airplane with a black mask over my eyes and let my mind find a place for him as an esteemed colleague, and in my heart as an ardently good and decent man. He is a mountain of a man, larger than life, too much to handle, too hot to play with, but way too cool to dismiss. GD is the kind of rolling prophet our generation turned out. Wavy gravy without the red nose, but looking sharp in his Hare Krishna headdress. I get out of the limo and turn back one last time, smile and quietly laugh. The cosmic giggle of two meeting in consciousness outside the temporal dictates of everyone's rather iffy material condition. If he ever writes the book he coerced me into writing this introduction for, I promise you, it will be as entertaining and enlightening as the big bad man himself. Hare Krishna to us everyone. More power to you, partner. After all, he is a committed Beatles man. Timothy Leary, Los Angeles. On Geoffrey Giuliano's character and talent, by his first intern, Brandon Stickney. 1990. I hadn't written a real book yet, one that was well developed and publishable, but this man had many. Eventually, the list rounded off in 2019 at 32 published in 14 languages over 4 decades. Then there were the hundreds of self-produced, written, and narrated audiobooks when the paper-printed book died forever at the hand of the Internet. These books, to which he dedicated his life, brought him fame and wealth, along with dishonor, destitution, and disenfranchisement. People often say writing is a solitary art, making it sound like authors simply sit there and type out masterpieces. A writer is more often thick in the business of life, constantly learning, questioning, trying to understand dramatic changes and events. Writers research subjects for hours, months, even years, sometimes deciding that information can never be used. Writers interview others. Writing a good book is more difficult than brain surgery and rocket science combined, and those professions require gigantic teams of people. Still, the hopeful patient or huge machine sometimes flatlines and dies. The writer's project, the book, takes everything the writer has in him. Good books, they say, are not written. They are bled. Some authors, who still actually write their own books, have small teams of helpers and researchers, but it is the writer who ultimately completes the work. Some, like Shakespeare, have written seemingly thousands of stories, while others, such as Proust, take a lifetime to write only half of one. Editing, proofreading, re-editing, re-proofreading, and doing it all over again and again is all part of this unending, excruciatingly creative process. Then how to find an agent and publisher brave enough to take on the work. Then one must forge ahead as if unhurt when there is rejection. One writer estimated 1% of his work had actually been published, the other taking up boxes in his basement. Make no mistake, publishing companies are the ultimate enemy, from rejection to theft. The smart author has a good attorney and an accountant. Some writers do it all themselves. Then there is the management of money, rights, foreign publishers, dealing with interviews, PR, fans, reviews, and cranks who are often delusional and violent. There too is the price his family must pay for the near constant engagement in his craft. The man about whom I write today opened the door to his home, heart, and hard-fought-for secrets of success in publishing and the arts to several young interns, including me. Doing all this in one day without missing a beat, that was the Geoffrey Giuliano I knew. Actors work at their voices, moves, appearance before they painfully memorize a script to become their character, to become another person. Who can do that? Why do you assume it's easy? They throw up before taking the stage to face thousands or in films perhaps millions. They are now another person. They speak and think as the character. They too must now interact with others on stage who are doing the same thing, sometimes poorly. Actors cannot talk to Samuel Beckett, Neil Simon, or Tennessee Williams, the author of the literary piece and play, to ask questions. They have to just go with it, flying by the seat of their pants, constantly seeking a job, most of them crap, endless auditioning, unreasonable rejection, all the while being authentic, not phony. talking your best game every day, giving every performance as if it was opening and closing night all in one, trying to gather together enough jobs to fund the basic life necessities, fighting ruthless casting gatekeepers, finding a patron and at times doing their bidding. The man was every bit as hard as the business he conquered, and I do not blame him, and nor should you. That was Geoffrey Giuliano as I knew him. A man of faith has already won the race, his mind and soul having been to heaven and back delftly to complete his earthly mission, devoted to God, to family, to his art, as if they were all one and the same in this temporal material plane. As a young man of passion, profound, and sometimes brutal self-inquiry, this righteous man found himself finally at the foot of a true master, and was blessed in a tiny Canadian temple and given a name of deep faith, Jagannath Das. This man now owed Sri Krishna his life and devotion until the day he died, then only to be swept away to infinity at the holy feet of Bhagavan Sri Krishna. At least that was the hope. He raised his family by the virtue of Vishnu and vegetarianism. He preached to many, counseled young devotees from the U.S., India, and Nepal. He built a grand temple and place of Vaishnava worship by the Erie Canal in sleepy Lockport, New York. He generously hosted holy men from many faiths, started, funded, and managed a food bank for the poor in both the USA and rural India. The man dealt effectively with bigoted locals and corrupt authorities. He was harassed by the local FBI, crossed the water to India many times, created works of art to finance his devotion and the care of his growing family. The man protected cows, raised peacocks, and with his good lady wife Vrinda, took over the care of several endangered grandchildren. He too brought many others into Krishna consciousness. This man was a life changer. I know this well. This man lived and worked with death every day and was not afraid. I saw it. This man found himself, was lost, then found himself again many times. This man saw much of what he patiently created destroyed, and even stolen by those closest to him. The man walked away, still solid from assaults which would have easily destroyed others. As he grew old, he became more quiet, pensive, understanding, compassionate, and forgiving. But the fire within him was still strong, always bold and ever the same. He was, I will honestly tell you, the youngest old man I ever saw. This was the Geoffrey Giuliano I knew and, yes, still love. Some thoughts by Geoffrey about Brandon. Pray for Brenda. I love you in my life, man. You know why? Because it's almost like it didn't happen. Without you to remember for me what I forgot, it might all be gone. And maybe if it was gone, it wouldn't count for anything. Maybe then Brenda died for nothing. I often worry she's joined the legion of ghosts of former residents at Market Street. They say if you commit suicide, you become a ghost. We don't know how she died. Who was that other Geoffrey? What pushed him to work so hard and then walk away from everything he accomplished without even locking the door? Who is he now? Who is this man that remembers, who smells a little bit of urine, who sits on a sofa, who doesn't understand his own life? Maybe if I write a book I will remember, I will learn. If I study, maybe I'll understand. And maybe I'll just sit here, day after day, frozen in dirty underpants on this cheap plastic sofa, smelling a little bit like urine. And Brenda might be right now looking out of one of the windows of Market Street, watching the snow swirl around the streetlight at the bottom of the drive, waiting, waiting, waiting. Some of the people who live there now might hear her and think it's just the wind. But it's Brenda, and nobody can help her now. This is my nightmare. This is my worst fear. This is the terror in my heart. Before, I used to go into the temple room at 3 o'clock in the morning and chant really loud, and it drove the ghosts away. Far away, back over to Cold Springs Road where they belong. But there's nobody there to do that now. So the living and the dead are all mixed up together. Nobody knows which is which. So, pray for Brenda. The worst thing I ever did was hit my mother and my wife. Everything else in life was cake. But from those actions alone, I knew that I was more or less doomed. I very quickly realized I better be real good, real fast. Although I am now 65 years old when I write, I am ageless. When I see my work on the page, I am freed from any gnawing bodily condition as an old man, and embrace a kind of eternity of the written word. I have never read nor heard this idea before. I would suppose a well-trained musician at any time in his life would be able to pick up his instrument and play at least to his own satisfaction. I can do that too with my words. At the end of his life, Salvador Dali used to paint in the dark, and when people came to visit, he would sit behind a screen so that they could not see the old man that he had become. I do not suffer from that malady. Now, the good news is that I have lived a relatively clean life, seemingly more than many. And now, at this advanced age, it pays dividends. I don't feel old. I don't look my age, or perhaps others simply look much older than they really are, and I do in fact look exactly my age. At any rate, the only bother about being 65 is my knees are a little bad. But that was mostly from sports injuries as a youngster and has little to do with the aging process. My hearing, too, was affected by the incautious, cavalier use of headphones as a teenager, but not at all by the aging process. I am certain that I am as young as I have ever been. The pangs of inevitable old age and death seem at least to be far away for the moment. I have an understanding that they will visit as they like at any time, but life was always like that for everyone. Obviously, one can die at any time. My worldview, and more importantly, my self-image, is that of a kind of timeless being. I see it in my work. I see it in my life, and to most intents and purposes, I still see it in the mirror. The great gentleman bluesman, Mississippi John Hurt, once said, "Don't die until you're dead." Many do, though. I saw it with my wife. This calling of death to oneself before one's time. I luckily entertained no such affliction. I knew a great yogi once who, when I asked his age, waved me away, saying, "Don't speak of such things." This was an extraordinary man who spent much of his life close to the Arctic Circle, and according to him, went barefoot a great deal of the time and wore only thin cotton robes much of the time. I will say his name here, lest it be forgotten. Swami Ram Tirtha. That I have witnessed miracles on a handful of occasions in my life is a fact. These glimpses of another reality, or the pulling back of the curtain for a moment, are very personal, and there's no need to relay the particulars here, if you'll excuse me. I would simply request your willing suspension of disbelief. I will say, too, that it only takes one or two of these events to transform what was once faith into fact. And while the whole world wonders if this or that might possibly be true, I sit wherever I may be, knowing it most definitely is. Still, unless I am particularly passionate or prompted, I keep it to myself. My life has been so much more than I ever bargained for, and in a good way. In hindsight, the trials I have endured, like losing $9 million, seem trivial upon examination, and far, far more good than bad has ever visited my door. I've often thought about the difference between waiting at the dentist or sitting on a beautiful beach somewhere. Both are the exact same activity, but done in a different consciousness. One is a drag, maybe even a kind of slow-moving terror for the faint of heart. The other is cool, fun, and people pay a lot of money to do it. It is, as I often say, the difference between waiting and hanging out. And what is that difference exactly? Again, just a very slight change of consciousness. Now that I know that, to me there is no difference, and I'm happy wherever I am. Throw me into a fucking prison cell and I might have to work a little harder at it, but by and large, I don't push the river. I go with the flow, and therefore the great majority of my time is okay. I neither crave too much and/or lament what I do not have. Yes, of course, I'm not always so equanimitous, and as I'm only a human being, I do sometimes get antsy and anxious. But I have a place inside, a retreat, where I can leave behind the cares of the world and be firmly in the moment. It is the access upon which I turn, and oh yes, it is as bold as love. I first became a Gaudiya Vaishnava aspiring devotee at the age of about 15. I am now 65. From the age of 15 until about 30, I was rather devout, though never a fanatic. Then again, from the age of about 35 to 45, I became very involved and even founded a large temple in Lockport, New York. My wife of many years, Srimati Vrindarani Devi, passed away suddenly on December 26, 2017. Now as I am at the halfway point of turning 66 and a widower, I think it is time to once again take up the easy-going practice of devotional yoga. As to the basics of my spiritual practice, which I will keep to myself, I will once again seek to embark upon charitable works and seva as I can in the name of my Guru. This time, however, there will be no big temples, veggie food banks, or publicity, and certainly no disciples or phony honorific titles. I will quietly resume my sadhana or practice in my own way, in my own time, with the hope it might somehow be mildly pleasing to my fellow devotees and most specifically the many realized masters who have graced my life so compassionately, and ultimately perhaps Bhagavan Sri Krishna himself, though I do not reasonably presume to ever aspire that high. After nearly 50 years on the path of bhakti, I am happy to remain merely a beginning student, ready to take instruction and render service to any and all of my brothers and sisters in devotion. To end up with a heart as soft as butter, and the name of Hari on my tongue, would be the perfection of my eventful, turbulent life. I have nothing to teach, nothing to really say, nothing to give, and nowhere to stay. No country, nor caste, and I aim to finish last. I am here to help as I can, but I am only a shadow. Geoffrey Giuliano, Jagannath Das. Albion 1953. Snow Angels and Tomato Sauce. While much is too strange to be believed, nothing is too strange to have happened. Unknown. Somewhere within every artist and creative person lies a monster. Elton John. Born on September 11th, 1953 in Rochester, New York, my first memory is of being in a crib in my parents' upstairs bedroom and seen a car headlight slowly flashing across the wall. It was this light against the muted floral wallpaper which brought me to self-consciousness, that is to say, that I became momentarily aware that I was no baby at all. Rather an eternal soul once again incarnate in this tiny body, destined to live a life my own long chain of unknown karma had wrought. I began to cry. I had a teddy bear which I kept for years until it disappeared sometime in the late 70s. The bear was always with me as a small child, but not this night. I heard my mother say to my father, understanding perfectly, although I was so young I could not yet speak, "Joe, he wants his teddy bear." My father, Joseph Robert Juliana, a portly plumbing and heating contractor in Albion, New York, slowly pulled back the covers, sat on the edge of the bed for a moment in his long white boxer shorts. "Where is it?" he asked my mother, Myrna Onisha Juliana, a 1950s housewife and a dedicated, self-educated, vociferous reader. "It's downstairs, I think, in the living room in the bassinet." I could hear my father rumbling down the narrow stairway of the modest, even tiny, 2-story square home at 127 Clinton Street. Moments later, a strong, shirtless arm handed me the bear. I drew it close and thought, another body and another life. This is not what I wanted, not what I deserve. Apparently it was exactly my fate to a mathematical certainty, and thus Geoffrey Joseph Juliana, aged then about 2, had momentarily awoken from the dream of life, only to very quickly once again assume the mind, mentality, and consciousness of an ordinary infant. All I can tell you is I forgot it all, but I didn't. It is a deep mystery without precedent, which I relay to you here with no explanation or justification, and yet it is entirely true. My recollections of my first years of life in Albion as the youngest of 5 much older children are scattered and ill-defined. I remember my mother putting me to bed at 6 o'clock and seeing the neighborhood kids outside my window still playing. I remember I never slept with anyone, which is now strange as my son Eden and I sleep together on a huge California king-size bed in Thailand. This is common with families in Southeast Asia, but obviously not so in the United States, at least not back then. I remember wetting the bed and somehow feeling comforted by the warm puddles of urine in the bedclothes. That is, until I woke up and realized exactly what I was lying in. The mid-1950s were a unique time in American life. I can remember a parade of fire trucks and pretty girls going by our house and the ever-present smell of tomato sauce in the air. This because the Hunt's factory was just at the end of our street across the railroad tracks. Whenever we went anywhere in the car, perhaps to Medina, Middleport, or to our summer cottage in Olcott, I remember thinking there was something wrong due to the absence of the overwhelming smell of boiling tomatoes. My first real friend was called Rachel Nudd. I remember that she was a pretty blonde, and that at about the age of 6 I was allowed to walk down the street and around the corner to her house, but warned by my mother not to go near the playground because some older boys had been recently caught putting rubber bands on the penises of the little kids. I was never quite sure what that was all about, and still I am not, but I dutifully avoided the playground just in case. In the winter, I remember being bundled up in one of those overblown snowsuits, going outside and making snow angels in the side yard, staring up at the clear blue sky, squinting my eyes to make the sun turn into fractal rainbows, and hearing only the muffled howl of the wind and my amplified breath in the polyester echo chamber of my overblown winter attire. I kid you not when I tell you it was at times like this that I used to think things like, maybe this is all a dream life. Maybe we are not even the dreamers. Perhaps God is dreaming us and all of this. Obviously it wasn't articulated as such, but that was the general idea. Strange that I would think like that as such a young boy. Stranger to it has proven more or less to be spectacularly true. I remember playing on the large gray Victorian spindled front porch one blustery spring day when 3 nuns, dressed in their traditional black habits, came storming down the sidewalk, their robes blowing in the wind. They were coming from Raleigh's red and white grocery store at the corner. I was stunned, as I had never seen nor heard of nuns before, and I thought sure that they were witches right out of The Wizard of Oz, coming to snatch me up and carry me away. I ran screaming into the house. A driveway away was the residence of the Monsignor of the local Catholic church, which also had a very small daycare center, which ultimately forced my mother's little nursery to close. I remember hearing terrible things about the wicked Monsignor and what a corrupt and dishonest man he was. He, too, wore black, but wasn't half as scary as those 3 nuns, whom I shall never forget and remember even today in stark, cinematic detail. There are a few stories from my Albion days which might bear repeating here. I had a kindergarten teacher by the name of Miss Claffey, who admonished me many times for speaking in class by sitting me in a huge metal washtub by the door of the classroom, to humiliate the student in front of his peers, but actually I quite enjoyed the attention. I can also remember that every day in the gymnasium we took a short nap in the afternoons after lunch. It must have been a good idea, as within minutes virtually all of the children were sound asleep, something which I could not reasonably abide. I took one of my Buster Brown shoes and, while pretending to be asleep, banged it on the floor underneath my cot so that no one would know it was me. Instantly, about 50 little kids sprung up in horror. Some even started to cry. Even then, I was a shit disturber. On another occasion, I remember there was a little black girl in our class who the kids picked on and made fun of. She was poor, and her clothes showed it. One day, as I was heading to the school bus, I found her quietly sobbing in the corner of the hall. We talked for a minute, and she stopped crying. "You come home with me," I offered. "Okay," she said. And off we went to the school bus, talking and laughing all the way home. As we walked together from the bus stop to my driveway, my mother came flying out of the house. "Geoffrey, who is this?" "It's my friend from school. I brought her home to stay with us," I replied. "What's your name, sweetheart?" my mother asked, gently kneeling down to straighten her sweater. Honestly, I cannot remember her name, so I won't make one up. Anyway, we got into the family car and drove her back to the school. I wasn't in trouble. In fact, my mother was proud of me. She understood that I only wanted to protect my little friend. My mother was very liberal and progressive in her thinking, but not so my father. He used words like nigger. He was Republican as well, and I remember him railing against those uppity Kennedy brothers. Still, he was a good man. I loved my father. He just wasn't educated. There is to me 2 distinct sides, which there may be to everyone I don't know. It is then, as now, I tend to be either rather good, kind, and genuinely altruistic, or absolutely horrible. Let me give you an example of the latter. There was a rich boy in our class in kindergarten, and I remember for some reason not liking that. He brought $1 to school every day to spend, while I and pretty much the rest of my class brought only 25 cents. We took the bus home together, as he lived nearby. One afternoon I offered to walk him halfway home. When we got just to the side of Raleigh's red and white, I suddenly jacked him up against the wall and demanded he give me that $1 or else. He did. Running off crying, I enjoyed his distress, and ambled well satisfied into the store, where I purchased a large box of cereal, as there was an advertisement on the package for a free dinosaur inside. Not being interested at all in the cereal, I snuck to the back of the store and emptied it all out onto the ground. There at the bottom, in a clear plastic wrapper, was a tiny blue dinosaur, the fruit of my first armed robbery. Long story short, I was busted by my parents and probably punished in some menial way. But it shows you something, doesn't it? I guess I was, sporadically, a very naughty boy. By the time I was born, 3 of my 4 siblings had left home. Joan was the oldest, far older than me. She was married to a quiet, good-natured factory worker, farm boy, and Korean War vet named Wendell Smith. He was tall, good-looking, and reminded me of John F. Kennedy. They lived outside of Albion in a place called Waterport. Their first child was Wendell Lee Smith, or Little Wendell, who was 18 months younger than me and was my first best friend and stayed that way up to the age of about 19. I remember my sister Joan bought a baby lamb, which we played with in the backyard of her country house. He was given the name Lambie Smith. I'd never been around animals before, and she was terrifically fun and gentle. One day my mother took me over there to play, and Lambie was nowhere to be seen. She had been sent to slaughter, and now resided in the family freezer. I was shocked and appalled, even at the tender age of about 6 years. These were my first thoughts about and exposure to animal cruelty. As many of you who know something about me, this was to remain a very important feature throughout my life. I think I should say something about my father. He was the eldest of 11 children born to Sicilian immigrant parents, and as a little boy was compelled by his father to leave school, probably at the end of his elementary education, and work on behalf of the family. One time when I was about 19, we were sitting in his old blue Ford work truck in Albion, parked on a steep incline across from the huge estate of Sanford E. Church, one of the leading town fathers, a well-known state politician, and finally governor. The imposing gray brick estate stood upon a full city block. There was a huge expanse of sidewalk on 4 sides, which my father told me he shoveled throughout many winters for Mr. Church for the princely sum of 25 cents, in the worst possible conditions, in an area of the country well known for huge amounts of snow. He would then take that money home and give it to his father. I learned something that day about the work ethic of my family, which I am thankful to say I have a goodly measure of, and I've seen it too in my daughters, Avalon and India, as well as my young half-Thai son, Eden. Unfortunately, when my father was unable to bring home the bacon to his father Giuseppe's satisfaction, my mother told me he was locked in the basement without food or water for days at a time, and once, as a very small boy, was strapped inside of an old toilet sitting unused in the corner of the dark dirt floor cellar. These cruel hardships, however, eventually paid off when an adult Joe Jelly, as he was called for his prominent stomach, became the very first merchant selling televisions to the populace in the 1940s. He gradually built himself up to owning his own shop by the Erie Canal Bridge on Main Street called Joe's Electric, where he not only sold appliances large and small, but was also a heating, plumbing contractor and qualified electrician. Sadly, he was too an inveterate gambler, and his addiction was legend in the town. One of the many things I heard over and over when I briefly moved back to Albion for a couple of years while attending the State University of New York near Brockport in 1976 was that my father would bang his head against stone walls repeatedly after losing at cards down at the local taxi shop. Sometimes my mother would go down there and pull him out while my sister Sheila and I waited in the car. On the few occasions when he did actually win big at the dog track, when we lived in Tampa, Florida, he reportedly admonished my mother Myrna never, ever to let me know he'd been successful, as he was deathly afraid that I too might succumb to his dreadful habit. I'm happy to say I never did. My father's self-destructive proclivities were not confined to his gambling, however. He also had a fierce and explosive temper, which could be violent, very violent. He once broke my mother's jaw, putting her in the hospital. She came back with her face swollen and her jaw wired together. She stayed that way for several weeks. I had an older brother I loved very much called Robert Knoll. Knoll because he was born on Christmas, and he was gay. Gay at a time when gay was not gay but queer, and you could be beaten or even killed given the right circumstance if people knew. I remember thinking that if my brother was gay, maybe I must be too, like it was something I could catch. Despite some familial gossip to the contrary, I was not similarly afflicted. Bob introduced me to music. We used to stay in the same bedroom, and when he went to work in the photographic department of Sibley's in Rochester, he would put several records on for me to listen to, as I was a little uneasy about being left alone. I remember him telling me everybody died. I couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, and I had no idea. I knew from TV you could get shot by a bad guy in the Cowboys or maybe killed by a monster, but I wasn't aware of anything like mortality. He also introduced me to science. He bought me a prism, which I broke at school, walking with it held up to my eyes, getting off in the distorted rainbows it was throwing off. I walked into a wall. Even then I was apparently a bit psychedelic. Bob also bought me a small bulb with a solar wheel inside so that when you put it in the window, it would spin as it caught the light. Later, when I was about 12, he bought me John Lennon's book In His Own Right and the Mamas and the Papas' first LP. We both liked Tiny Tim when he came out in 1967. Bob used to go to New York sometimes. He knew and was good friends with Allen Ginsberg, Andy Warhol, and Jasper Johns, but those names meant nothing to me at the time. I remember him showing me the original lyrics to Killing Me Softly, a song made famous by Roberta Flack, which the composer had given him, so I guess he introduced me to the world of memorabilia as well. It was also through Robert that I heard my first spoken-word record, of which Bob had a reasonably good collection. One of them, Edgar Allan Poe's Tales of Mystery and Imagination, was a particular favorite. And as I have spent the last 40 years producing audiobooks for the biggest companies in the world and ending up with my own firm, Icon Audio Arts, that was to me a true watershed moment. In fact, I used to use an old broom as a microphone and pretend to be a radio announcer, so I'm not sure if it was fate or a self-fulfilling prophecy that later I became just that and more. 3 more things stick out about my brother from around 1966. The first, that he was stabbed by a hitchhiker while he was trying to make a pass at him. The particulars, of course, I found out much later. The other thing that was totally unbelievable to me was that he was friends with an interracial couple with the last name of Glover. The man was very black, like an African, and the woman was, of course, white. I'd never seen or even heard of such a thing, and I remember being astounded when I met them. I was afraid when Mr. Glover bent over to shake my hand. He had a son called Danny Glover. My brother, I guess, was a bit of a beatnik. I am proud to say he started a poetic literary magazine in Rochester called Cabbages and Kings, which is still published today. He was involved in theater and had an interesting apartment filled with artworks. Bob was also a lay gourmet, thus everything was always new and interesting to me at his place, and I never missed an opportunity to join him on weekends or school holidays. In 1966, he had a large second-floor apartment on Goodman Street in Rochester, and just across the street was a bar frequented by local would-be hippies. Although I was just a kid, somehow nobody noticed, and I used to go over there every night and actually made out with some university girls and purchased my first marijuana for $5. I hid it in the garage for a few days while I summoned up the courage to actually smoke it. When I did, I felt great. These were indeed exciting times. My father used to say that Bob was a playboy, and I'd say, "No, Dad, he's gay." I think he understood the difference, but he didn't want to accept it. Those two had a troubled relationship, and it was clear that of the 2 boys, I was the favorite. I'm not sure how much difference this made to Robert, as he was many years older than me. The absolutely most dramatic, cinematic event of my childhood, cinematic in the sense that it was both unreal and terrifying to a little boy, was the time my father was beating up my mother at 128 Clinton. It wasn't a slap or anything. He was clubbing her with a closed fist. There was blood everywhere. I was in the upstairs hall at the head of the stairs looking into the living room crying when my brother came running through the hall with a shotgun. I don't know where he got it, and I never saw it again. But he pointed it at my father, screaming, "Get away from her!" "Put that gun down," my father ordered. "Get away from her!" Bob again yelled. What happened after that I can't honestly remember, and I will not anywhere in this book include anything that I'm not absolutely sure about. Suffice to say, there were no shots fired, and this kind of thing went on for several years. I can remember one time at our cottage in Orchid, another such brutal attack on my mother occurred. My sister Sheila and I were bundled up by a neighbor, Mrs. Snurstein, and taken across the street to her house. The sheriffs came, and I guess things calmed down. Men were not arrested in those days for beating up their wives. It was seen as a private matter, and the cops' unofficial mandate was to simply try and keep things vaguely under control. We spent the night there in that strange house with my mother's best friend. The next morning, my mom showed up and took us home. I remember, although the two women spent time together almost daily, they never called each other by their first names, which then as now I find very odd. It was always, "Mrs. Juliana, would you like another cup of tea?" "Why, thank you, Mrs. Snurstein, I certainly would." It was a different time. As to my early life in Albion, I remember once Dad and I went to the A&P to shop, and there was a large Cadillac with several black guys and a platinum blonde in the middle of the front seat. "Look at that," he said in disgust. "A nigger lover." I remember being shocked and understanding intrinsically this was wrong, very wrong, but consistent with his limited view of the world. He did a lot of work at a migrant place called Conley's Camp. He used to come home and tell us he got out his grinding wheel to do this or that, and all the black guys ran out with their switchblades asking him to sharpen them. Conley's Camp was out on what they called the muck, where they grew cabbage. Dad was only half joking when he told that story, but I remember having to pretend we'd all heard it for the first time instead of the 100th. I recall feeling somewhat uneasy around my father. He was generally distant and used to call all the kids honey or sweetheart, rarely me by my name, and when he did, that too felt uncomfortable and strained. That is not to say I didn't love my father or that he didn't love me. I think after his brutal childhood he didn't know how to show love at all, at least not in any conventional way. An example of this would be when I was married and had my first child in 1976. Something came up and my father and I had an argument. He stormed off and slammed the door, and we didn't see him for days. At the time, I was a theater student in Brockport, so I was gone a lot of the time, and as my wife was a nude model in the art department, there was often no one home. One evening when we came back, Brenda opened the refrigerator, and it was completely filled by my father. That is how Joe Jelly told you he loved you. Albion, New York, the seat of Orleans County, was an architecturally beautiful Victorian town. There is a huge vein of sandstone which runs under the area all the way to India. So many of the buildings were crafted by Italian immigrants from this beautiful red stone. The same stone, by the way, that much of Jaipur, the pink city of India, is made from. I remember one late afternoon in the 1950s when my wonderful sister Sharon, who was studying to be a nurse at Mercy Hospital in Buffalo, came home for Christmas and took me out in the car for some last-minute shopping. The snow was crusty, glistening like diamonds, covering the huge dome of the Orleans County building with the reflected light of the evening sun. We made our way downtown, and it was just the perfect Norman Rockwell picture of America, which will never be again. An America where children played outside and came home at dark. An America where people never locked their doors. An America where there were no drugs, gangs, or drive-by shootings. An America where a man could earn a living for his whole family while mom stayed at home looking after the kids and pursuing her own interest. An America of hope, of promise, of stability. An America long gone. My mother, Myrna Onisha Juliana, was from a place called Four Corners in Kendall, deep in the Orleans County countryside. Her mother, Pearl, was on the Board of Education and was a single mom with 2 daughters, Myrna and the slightly older Myra. This was a time when such things were beyond scandal. My grandfather was apparently 6'8", and his name was Elvert Washington Cooney. He walked out on the family when my mother was very young. Pearl eventually remarried a lovely man whom I remember, a dairy farmer by the name of Arnold Comstock. He was at our house the day he had a heart attack and died. I was taken out back to play while the ambulance came, but I saw it going by through the trees and I understood. I never knew my grandmother. Both of my parents are important to the man I later became. But my mother perhaps more so. Although she had no formal education, she was a great reader, and my eldest sister Joan used to tell me she would go to the Swan Library in Albion a couple of times a week, carrying a huge bag of books by Socrates, Hawthorne, Shakespeare, Shaw, and Marx, something unheard of in those days. Although I fucked around in university living on Jimmy Carter's generous student loans, I didn't really do too much of anything, and whatever I became was the result of my own self-education, a trait I apparently picked up from my mother. One of the few things I know about my mother's childhood was that she loved American Indians and burned down the family barn, which I believe subsequently sent her to a girls' school in Batavia for a period of reflection. She was highly intelligent, but often deliberately annoying, with the ability to push people's buttons like no one I've ever met. To say she was eccentric is an understatement. A good example would be the way she dealt with her children's Sicilian heritage. In those days, Italians were looked down upon in a very real way, and were segregated to the wrong part of town, and considered by the mainly Protestant populace to be rather too foreign to ever be really accepted into mainstream society. My mother was German-Irish, and I know she felt like that because I was seldom allowed to go over to my grandmother's house, a place I loved. Nor was it allowed that Italian should be spoken in our house. There was always a lot of cheek-pinching at Grandma's, back-slapping, and food. My dad had 10 brothers, and family occasions at my grandparents' were straight out of Goodfellas. There was Johnny, Jimmy, Sammy, Charlie, Tony, and on and on. They all wore silk suits, had pencil-thin mustaches, and seemed like they were doing very well for themselves. Later, my father told me several, whom shall remain nameless, were in fact associated with the local mafia at some very minor level. I asked him why he never joined, because his younger siblings were making money hand over fist, and he told me simply he was scared. There were secret family stories about rum running from Canada and late-night truckloads of liquor picked up on the beach, as well as railroad cars being liberated from whatever it was of value they happened to be carrying. But this was all very vague and certainly didn't matter to me then or now. In fact, to be fair, it's quite possible that these are indeed faulty memories, or that someone was bullshitting me. What I do know for sure is that at home we were never allowed to eat spaghetti, pizza, or even ketchup, as my mother didn't like it. More importantly, perhaps, she considered it somehow too foreign and therefore provocative. To be honest, my father was extremely violent, but never, ever once to the children, but habitually to my mom and himself. My mother was vaguely verbally aggressive, or at the very least often super annoying, and suffered, I'm sure, from an undiagnosed clinical psychiatric disorder. My brother was gay, which I only found out at the age of 12 wasn't catchy. Still, perhaps the most meaningful to me was that I was born under a great lie. Let me explain. My mother never told my father she was pregnant, nor anyone else. When she went into labor in the early morning of September 11th, it was only then she revealed to my father and her sister that she was about to bear a child. She was rushed to the nearby city of Rochester, and I came into this world at approximately 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon under a cloud of deception. I have always wondered about that, and it has silently gnawed away at me. Why was I kept a secret until the very last moment? How is it my father didn't know? Was it because my mother was in her 50s at the time? In a rare moment of personal confession to me about her life with my father, my mother told me in those days married couples didn't really expose themselves to each other or engage in a lot of what was thought to be exotic foreplay, but rather when they had sex, the woman might pull her nightskirt up while the man his pajamas down, and everything would be taken care of discreetly under the covers. This might explain how my mother was able to pull off this rather colossal, inexplicable ruse. The reasons behind it, however, remain a mystery. Orchid Beach, 1962-1965. Two possibilities exist. Either we are alone in the universe or we are not. Both are equally terrifying. Arthur C. Clarke. It's a very salutary thing to realize the rather dull universe in which most of us spend most of our time is not the only universe there is. I think it's healthy people should have this experience. Aldous Huxley. The Beatles saved the world from terminal boredom. George Harrison to the author, 1984. Although my parents never divorced, they were, as my mother used to say, geographically separated. Dad used to drive down from Albion on Wednesday afternoons to spend the night coming back on the weekend. There was always an uneasiness when my father was in the house, which was probably more to do with my parents' rocky relationship, I suspect, than me. My father generally called me honey or sweetheart, rarely Jeff or Geoffrey. Sometimes I wonder if he actually knew my name. Orchid Beach in Niagara County, then as now, is about 20 miles from Niagara Falls and 12 from Lockport, a small city of about 30,000, where I later spent the better part of my adulthood and from which much of my ancestral family came. Orchid was a beautiful, almost forgotten hamlet of working-class folks at the time my mother, my sister Sheila, and I moved there from Albion in 1963. I would have been 10. The only reason I have any concept of the date was that I remember watching the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show there in the winter of '64. I used to spend a lot of time alone with my mother as a kid. I was the youngest, and the other four left long ago. My mother had me when she was 54, so with the exception of Sheila, who was 6 years older, the rest of my siblings were grown-ups. My mother, Myrna, or Perna, as she was known to the grandkids, could take you to the edge of hara-kiri with her unrelenting, piercing superverbals. Her words were weaponized, which she used to hurt, harass, or control you, and in her mind, protect herself. She was a genuine psychotic, but had an ingratiating way of telling a story. She was, however, unmatched by the unwashed comedic talent of my plumbing and heating contractor father, Joe Jelly. Dad had a lot of sly one-liners, which he carried around with him like the old tools in his beat-up Ford panel truck. When the Beatles came on the Sullivan Show, he playfully feigned horror, then stormed out of the house after they were on and disappeared down the road. The phone rang about 15 minutes later. He called my mother and I to come and meet him at the main intersection in town near the old Civil War statue. There was Joe Jelly in the middle of the street, holding a mop on his head as if mimicking the Beatles' long locks, singing "Yeah, yeah, yeah," and yelling, "Like son, like father." About half the town was more impressed with his performance than the Beatles. My father, too, used to be observed surreptitiously making jello molds on a TV tray in the living room whilst watching Let's Make a Deal. He was odd. In the fall and winter, there were, of course, dreadful gales which literally shook the house to its iffy foundations from the frigid north winds which blew across the lake from Canada. I slept alone in an old twin bed with a tattered blue blanket with anchors and seashells across it on the second floor facing the street. I was often awoken at night by the dull, ghostly, haunting sounds of foghorns wafting in from the lake where huge pencil-shaped freighters were transversing the dangerous waters to complete their run of commercial goods of timber, iron, rubber, machine parts, and coal from southern Ontario to cities such as Rochester, where I was born, and other ports of call along the rocky recesses of the smallest but deepest of the Great Lakes. Those foghorns and their slow, mournful, deadly, deathly moan scared the shit out of me. I would slowly sit up and linger at the edge of my bed until I was sure what I was hearing was what the adults assured me it was, rather than some old ghost lumbering down upon the cottage to scoop me up and spirit me off somewhere out over the dark, deadly waters. My parents bought the cottage for $4,000 about 20 years before I was born. It was a run-down, 2-floor, 2-bedroom wood-frame cottage with a porch on 2 sides situated on the edge of a tall, wild bank overlooking Lake Ontario. Perhaps its greatest feature were the long, decaying gray steps leading halfway down the bank to a large terraced deck where we could sit and observe the rich men's sailboats racing by. Down on the beach there was a beautiful ancient willow, who invited my nephew Wendell and I to climb far up onto its strong giant limbs to look out over the lake. In the day there were ladybugs everywhere. At night, fireflies, which we used to catch and put into mason jars, poking holes in the top of the lid so they wouldn't die. Of course they always did. We did the same with giant neon green grasshoppers with the inevitable result. Always, 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 there was the rushing, swirling, crashing, calling, soothing sounds of the lake. At least 2 or 3 times a year out at the end of the moss-covered hotel pier, before it broke up and crashed into the surf one late autumn afternoon, would stand a lone piper dressed in full Scottish regalia, playing his bagpipes mournfully at dusk for the pleasure of the lake. The sound would roll over the shore and up the bank, filling our living room with the wonderful, melancholy, beckoning music. Sometimes we would see him. Sometimes we wouldn't. I often wondered if he was a phantom from another time. A time before the great hotel burned down, and there were fancy people dressed in tuxedos and ball gowns listening to Benny Goodman and his orchestra play carelessly well into the night. There were definitely parallels which could be drawn to The Shining around where I lived as a boy. As Mr. Halloran said, it had a shine to it. The beach was a magical place, and the lake its colossal gray master. It was down there, sitting alone, that I first caught a glimpse of God rushing by. It was more spiritual than magical, but had plenty of both. Even today, so many decades on, everyone should go to Orchid and sit quietly on the beach alone at sunset. It will change you forever. I longed to take my son Eden there one day soon to sit together and experience the magic I knew could never leave that place. I may now be 65 instead of 11, but I know if I go back, it will be exactly the same. Old things happen in Orchid. Several 100 feet away from my house, just before the entrance of Kroll Park, there was a place we called the Terraces, which was the now grassy foundational remains of the Grand Olcott Beach Hotel, which burned down to the ground so many years before. When I saw The Shining many years later, I knew all about ghost hotels, even ones which no longer existed. The crater left from the epic tragedy of the Great Orchid Fire, so close to my boyhood home, imprinted a kind of unspoken dread upon everyone in the tiny hamlet. As Mr. Halloran tells young Danny in The Shining, sometimes things leave a trace of themselves behind after a cataclysmic event, like burnt toast. There was definitely that in Orchid. Here is what the 21st century Internet oracle Wikipedia has to say about the spooky little village in which I lived off and on from about the age of 8 to 20. The Luna Amusement Park was on the shore of Lake Ontario in Orchid Beach. A popular venue for live entertainment, it was open to the public from 1898 to 1927, predating the Coney Island Luna Park by 5 years. The name of the dance hall and the inscription on the arch spanning the park's main entrance led to the commonly used name of Dreamland. In contrast to the similarly named parks opened throughout the United States from 1903 to 1914, the primary attraction presented by the Orchid Beach Luna Park were not large rides like Shoot the Chutes and roller coasters, but a selection of Lake Ontario's shore, a popular swimming attraction, restaurants, and concessions shared by the park and nearby Castle Inn. Topping that off was live entertainment at the Dreamland Dance Hall. Smaller-scale mechanical rides were gradually added, including a circle swing ride. While the lives of most of the other Luna parks were relatively brief, virtually all were gone by 1915, the Orchid Beach Park maintained its prominence as a popular recreation stop and a major venue for live entertainment into the 1910s, as Orchid remained a popular stop for both steamboats along the shore of Lake Ontario and interturban trains connecting Albany, Niagara Falls, and Buffalo. At the end of World War I, Orchid's prominence as a popular tourist destination faded quickly as the automobile replaced trains and steamboats as the town's primary method of access. As tourist dollars declined in the region, so did Luna Park and its main competitor, Rialto Park. While the crowds were steadily dwindling in the 1920s, Luna Park managed to survive until the 1926 season, its last in operation. The following year, a massive fire destroyed virtually every building on Cooper Street, including the Castle Inn and the train station, and most of Main Street. Luna Park was also destroyed. The beachside hotels could not be saved and were eventually razed. When Orchid Amusement Park opened amidst a resurgence of the city, so was nearby Rialto Park, opened in 1902. It was demolished in 1928. Orchid didn't have any operating amusement parks until 1940, when Orchid Amusement Parks opened amidst a resurgence of the city, staying in operation until 1986. New Rialto Park opened at the site of its namesake in 1942 and stayed in operation for 50 years. For all of that, the local Historical Association, too, has summed up the beautiful summer tourist town's colorful past. Getting from Lockport to Orchid prior to 1900 meant riding a stagecoach pulled by a team of horses. However, many people arrived in Orchid using their own buggies, wagons, bicycles, or whatever means they had at their disposal. Orchid Beach developed rapidly, which continued through the end of the 19th century. A visit from then-Governor Theodore Roosevelt to the Pioneer Association picnic in 1899 saw a crowd numbering some 20,000 people. Interest in the community led to the introduction of the International Railway, IRC, building a trolley line from Lockport to Orchid. On the first day of operation, on August 27, 1900, 12,000 passengers came along for the ride. In order to afford better accommodation and services to the visiting public, the IRC erected a grand hotel simply named the Orchid Beach Hotel. The hotel boasted 100 rooms, a ballroom, a dining room overlooking the lake, a ladies' beauty parlor, barber shop, game room in the beach level, and several small dressing rooms where patrons could change into a bathing suit or back into their street clothes after their swim. At the time of the big bands, almost all of them headlined at the Orchid Beach Hotel at one time or another. Even though the hotel suffered a devastating fire, the owners made the necessary repairs and operations and continued into the 1930s. Two other factors combined to spell the demise of this mecca of recreation: the Great Depression and the automobile. Most visitors to Orchid began to arrive by car and usually departed home the same day. As a result, the hotel and trolleys suffered a serious decline. And so it was in 1937 the decision was made to demolish the hotel, signaling the end of the line for a once thriving landmark of the region. In warmer weather, often around late August, I would often sit alone, dead silent on the back porch facing the lake, in absolute wonder as the unrelenting, violent rain drilled down from the sky upon the frothy, turbulent brown waters below. I used to wait expectantly for weeks for these amazing events when heaven and earth clashed in a grand cacophony of nature's absolute power in front of me, maybe just for me. I would watch for a while, then would slowly make my way down the long, gray, rickety stairs to our beach, where I would dive headlong into the exploding surf. Whenever it rained like that, although it looked as if the world were coming to an end and no one but me dared to even think about swimming, the waters were always deliciously warm. From the moment I dived in, I had absolutely no control over anything, and I would immediately be picked up by the undertow, hauled out to sea, only to be tossed back upon the shore in a rolling, out-of-control tumble, where I would pick myself up, turning to look at the horizon, screaming along with the thunder. Most of the cottages on Ontario Street were made of wood and were therefore slowly rotting away, as none of the places had foundations. In fact, in our house there was a room we called the Pink Room, painted pink, where the floor started to give way and you could see the dirt underneath. It's a miracle the house didn't go tumbling down the hill when the north wind pitched across the lake from Canada, and before that the Antarctic. Everyone who stayed winters in Orchid very quickly learned to respect the absolute authority of the north wind. The house shook. Our house shook and swayed significantly, often during furious gales prompted by the great north wind. Orchid was a rude, rough little town, where nobody had any money, and there were only a few really nice houses in a place called the Bluff, owned mostly by local lawyers and businessmen from Lockport. There were also 2 ragged amusement parks left over from Orchid's heyday in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. They both closed down by the late 80s. But a group of dedicated local ladies did their best to reconstruct the merry-go-round and a couple of rides at the park in front of our house called New Rialto in the late 1990s. It's not at all what it was back in the day when I used to go to bed to the sound of the merry-go-round's antique mechanical orchestra, and I could see the Ferris wheel giving rides to excited, screeching teens from my bedroom window. One of the good memories I have of spending time with my dad was playing game after game of skee-ball at an arcade on the corner of Main Street. Joe Jelly was a skee-ball Jedi master who showed me just how to bank the heavy wooden ball slightly to the right, bouncing off the side so it would inevitably jump neatly up into the center ring for 50 points. The other big fun was at the smaller amusement park at the edge of town whose name escapes me. There was a fantastic 1950s funhouse in which you got into a fanciful Art Deco-style seat on a track and were then shown into the bowels of preteen hell by a muscle-bound country boy who gave you a great push which sent you rocketing through the scariest collection of phony devils, goblins, and a kid dressed up as Frankenstein who jumped out in front of you as you rounded a particularly precarious corner, making your way finally to the end, crashing into the daylight, laughing and crying at the same time. The only problem was the ride often broke down, losing momentum on the tracks. So you had to sit there for a few minutes until the big kid who worked the ride realized, came in and pushed you out. Our old house at 5969 Ontario Street wasn't ever meant to be lived in full-time and was not winterized. The walls were 2-inch thick pine planks tongue and groove, covered on the outside with gray asbestos shingles, but there was absolutely no insulation, and it was as cold as hell 5 months of the year. The rickety, claustrophobic upstairs was particularly bad. You had to pile as many blankets as you could on the bed and sleep in your clothes. I remember the windows freezing over and seeing my breath come out like cool puffs of smoke as I lay in bed. It is now not lost on me that my father was a plumbing and heating contractor, and although he eventually put in a small gas heater in the corner of one end of the large open living room on the lakeside, most of our heat came from a wonderful cobblestone fireplace with a hand-hewn mantel. They say it was made by a blind man, in front of which my father, myself, Wendell, and my mother warmed our asses and gathered together to tell tall tales about our everyday life in obscurity. I can tell you with a great degree of certainty that even the Kennedys couldn't have possibly had a greater, more magnificent, more welcoming fireplace. Wendell and I used to gather driftwood from the beach and drag it up the long flight of stairs to make fires which were absurdly big, which spit out large burning coals onto the old brown paisley carpet, which we would all run to stamp out. The bathroom was just a toilet and a small sink. There was no shower or bathtub. When I turned 12, my father finally knocked out a wall into the master bedroom and put in a small tub and shower. Before that, we washed in the sink. My mother never worked, and my father had long ago lost his 5-man crew and was working out of an old truck he painted stark blue with house paint and a roller. Now in his late 50s, he was working for people who couldn't afford a real plumbing and heating contractor. He mostly did odd maintenance jobs around the one-horse town in which he lived in Orleans County. At one point he stayed for a few years in the dirt-floor basement of an old barber shop he owned off of Main Street in Albion. He had his bed there amongst his plumbing tools. He used to ask me if I wanted to spend the night, but I always made a polite excuse because, quite frankly, I was embarrassed. I don't know what happened. It could have been the gambling or his womanizing. I remember my Aunt Myra telling me that he was in trouble with the government, presumably over taxes. I was too young to really know, but there was never any money, I know that. I wore the same clothes to school every day, mostly clean. But we didn't have a washing machine, so we would go to a local laundromat once a week on the other side of the muddy creek which divided the village. It was a hard, mostly brutal life for a little boy. Alcott Beach was, however, wonderful in the summer, with the nearby rolling parks, Laverne's friendly happening skating rink, the famous all-night seafood stand, our private beach, the water, the beautiful sailboat regattas, and the huge boulders full of quartz along the shore. There were monarch butterflies by the hundreds who hovered around the Queen Anne's lace which grew everywhere, with wild raspberries and the deadly nightshade we were constantly warned never to go near. In the winter, however, it was a frozen hell, and neither designed nor intended for year-round residents. Lake Ontario inevitably froze into a labyrinth of otherworldly ice caves in the dead of winter, about 30 feet out. Over the years, several boys were lost exploring the admittedly magnetic formations which quite reasonably terrified my mother. I ventured out onto the ice field about 5 or 6 feet a couple of times, but I was well aware of how unstable they were and how easy it was to be swallowed up inside and never be seen again. Once I saw the police and paramedics out there looking for somebody with the beach all roped off with yellow tape, but whoever it was they were looking for, they never found them, at least not until spring. Certainly, in the dead of winter, there was literally nowhere to go and nothing to do. So I used to watch the TV wafting across the lake from Toronto. We didn't have an antenna on the house, only old second-hand rabbit ears adorned with tin foil, so we couldn't really even get the 3 Buffalo stations with any regularity. As Toronto was only 40 miles straight across from our house, we were able to pick up 2 channels from Canada. As part of Her Majesty's Empire, they played a lot of British movies, which I remember watching and carefully mouthing the different accents I heard. I did that with cartoons as well, and got most of the voices down pat, with the exception of Donald Duck. I could never do him. It was an odd skill set, which would serve me later in life. The isolation I experienced as a child was pretty much at the door of both of my parents. My father, unable to connect on only the most superficial level, although witty, was demonstrably distant in his interactions with his youngest son. I remember once he bought me a new fishing rod, telling me that at 5 a.m. sharp the next morning we would be up and out of the house digging worms in the front yard and then making our way to Headley's Pier, where he assured me we would catch the really big ones. I was up at 4, dressed and ready to go. By the time 5 rolled around, I heard nothing. An hour later, still nothing. So I parked myself in front of my parents' bedroom, purposefully dropping things, coughing, knocking my head lightly against the wall to try and rouse my father. Around 8 I heard them quietly talking and laughing, so I knew they were awake. Unfortunately, he didn't come out until 9 o'clock. Almost tripping over me, he asked, "What are you doing?" "Well, we were supposed to go fishing this morning," I replied. "Oh, we'll do that another time," he said flatly as he made his way to the bathroom. We never did. The fishing pole sat in the corner of my room. I tried to go once on my own at the end of the pier, but comically a very large rainbow trout got hooked on my line and effortlessly pulled the rod out of my hand into the unknown depths of Lake Ontario. I guess I was a little slow with some things, like the time in Tampa when I lit a cherry bomb but didn't know I was supposed to throw it away. I almost blew my hand off. That is not to say that I do not have fond memories of my father from those days. He was a character very much in the same way that I am a character. He had a white Rambler convertible in which we used to go to Newfane together on summer days for crappy Little Debbie cakes at the only grocery store, Bell's. He wore a sporty little canvas hat and sang Volare out loud with fellow paisan Dean Martin from nearby Steubenville, Ohio, on the radio. He took me for root beer floats and chili dogs in Wright's Corners, and on odd Sundays we would go in the morning to Wilson Harbor, waiting for the fishing boats to come in, and buy fish at the dock. All the way home he would tell me how fresh it would be and was. Dad had a great sense of humor, and could construct a pun or clever put-down as well as any university man I've known. Later, when we moved to Tampa, Florida, he would take me to the extravagant downtown Tampa Theater, where we saw all of Dean Martin's Matt Helm movies and The Godfather, which he absolutely loved. I think it made him proud to be Italian. Me too. I looked up to my father. I just wish he would have looked down at me. My mother spent a lot of time in bed reading, biting her nails, and oddly sucking on her index finger. Although I had 4 siblings, 3 were gone and happy to be so. So as far as I was concerned, I was raised pretty much as an only child. I was never hugged or kissed as a kid. I knew my mother loved me in her own way, but she was never ever affectionate. I never had a dog, a birthday party, and kids weren't allowed to come in to play. I often felt I was in the way, probably accidentally conceived and only around because I was. My mother's obvious chronic depression hung over the old house on Ontario Street like a dark cloud of hopelessness and constant unease. I lost myself listening to rock music on WKBW Buffalo, pretending to be a disc jockey with an old broom, reading Superman comics and adventure stories, drawing and practicing my funny voices. Half a century later, I feel very sorry for that little boy. In the end, although I had a great life, but there was certainly little indication that was to be the case based on my boyhood. Amazing to me now, 2 of my favorite books as a child were on the FBI and another on the Secret Service. I guess I harbored a secret desire to someday be on one side or other of the law enforcement spectrum as either a criminal or a cop. Radio meant a lot to me. I used to listen at night with my old transistor set propped up in a chair near the bed. These were classic radio days, and we had one of the best stations in America, WKBW AM 1520 on your radio dial. Those wonderful, deep voices I heard nightly erupting through the vocal cords of great DJs like Joey Reynolds and Danny Nevereth, advertising Lancaster Speedway and Buffalo Raceway. Then there was the erudite Irv Weinstein, fronting Pulse Beat News, with frequent bulletins on the many aberrant, pistol-packing punks who pounded a Polish plumber into the pavement, or perhaps the heroic actions of blazebusters in Tonawanda, putting out brush fires behind the long-abandoned, once elegant Buffalo rail station. Or when the Pope was shot, Irv announced it as the peace of a papal appearance shattered by gunfire. His wonderful word picture stretched the imagination of people in such a glorious, festive, outrageously amusing way that if Irv told you the entire city of Buffalo had been arrested for arson in Cheektowaga, Lackawanna, or Tonawanda, you would fucking believe him. A few years later, when we were all young hippies, he would ask nightly, "It's 11 o'clock. Do you know where your children are?" We'd be sitting there stoned, smoking joints and yelling at the TV, "Yeah, dude, we're here getting all fucked up." As far as I'm concerned, Irv Weinstein could have easily given even Dylan a run for his money when it came to putting together punctuated platitudes primarily for the peasant populace. God, I love that man. As author Steve Chahone wrote in his memorable book on the great broadcaster, simply entitled Irv, without promoting a name, Irv was the runaway favorite news anchor in Buffalo. He was the favorite of more than a third of those with a preference, and was more popular than numbers 2, 3, and 4 combined. He was the favorite newscaster of young and old, men and women, those making under 25, those making 25 to 50, and those making over 50,000. He was the favorite newscaster of those of Polish descent, Italian ancestry, Irish English, and African American too. Also in Buffalo, the Erie County suburbs, Niagara County and Cattaraugus, and Chautauqua County, Irv was always on top. In every category analyzed, Irv Weinstein was a runaway pick as Buffalo's favorite newsman. These men were giants to me, especially Weinstein. He spoke with such moral authority, he could not be ignored, and you knew that whatever he was saying, this man was righteous, fair, and just in all things. Those wonderful, friendly, funny, comforting voices filled my barren, barn-like room without even a light bulb, and fueled dreams of one day being on the radio myself, a dream which actually materialized big time some 30 years later when I hosted my own internationally syndicated show called Geoffrey Giuliano's Roots of Rock for 5 years for Westwood One. Then, of course, there were the hundreds of audiobooks I narrated for virtually every publisher in the business and how I became rich. None of that, however, would ever have happened if it wasn't for WKBW and the ambitious dreams it sowed inside me. Going through this now, reliving it all in a collection of words, I understand why I put off writing this book for so many years. It is a painful reckoning of an innocent little boy trying to survive in an environment defined by violence, poverty, and my mother's deep depression. Hopefully, writing it down will somehow exorcise this ancient mojo from my psyche, but more than anything, finally and forever, kill the past stone dead, and make sure none of this or anything like it is ever visited upon my beloved young son Eden. No greater aspiration could ever be ascribed to what may prove to be my final book of over 32. Like an old ghost rattling the teacups of my mind for over 6 decades, this is almost certainly my last chance to be free of the past. In a lifetime spent traveling at warp speed to get away from all of this, I am determined to emerge at the end of my life free and unfettered, the hero of my own story. I never had much to do with my brother and sisters. But I can tell you when I broached the subject of writing this book now many years ago at the height of my fame as an author, two were very much against it, and with good reason, as there are secrets in our family which were never really spoken about, and they hoped never would be. As we are now in mid-2019, my eldest sister Joan is in a nursing home, and on the few occasions I've talked to her from Bangkok, it's clear she suffers from dementia. The last time we talked, we had a perfectly reasonable, lucid conversation when she told me she had to go because she was waiting for her daddy to come pick her up. Last year, my lovely, intelligent sister Sharon, whom I was particularly fond of, died of cancer. My brother Robert passed away from HIV many years ago. A sad, self-inflicted death, as towards the end of his life he went crazy with needles, shooting up God knows what and snorting whatever he could get his hands on. My sister Sheila and I have not been close since I was about 12, and we haven't spoken in over 30 years. Obviously, both my parents are long dead and are buried together on a small windy terrace in Mount Albion. So as I'm now 65, there is no family and no reason left to keep quiet. There were times, many times in Orchid, when my mother went into some kind of psychotic breakdown and enacted a kind of ritual torture against me. The scenario was pretty much the same. I had crossed some kind of imaginary line in her mind. Perhaps breaking a plate, tramping mud through the house, being a bit of a smart-ass, or some other such minor infraction. She would then make me stand in a corner and not move, taking her clothes off, screaming things like, "I wish you were never born. I hate your guts. Nobody will ever like you. I curse the day you were born," etc., etc. Inevitably, she would bite down hard on her wrist until it bled, all the while doing an insane dance around the room. "Do you like this? Look at this. You made me do it." If for any reason I moved an inch, she would beat me with a wire coat hanger until there were welts pretty much all over my body. If I flinched, I got more. I remember trying to swallow my tears, closing my eyes lightly to try and stop the flow, concentrating on not moving even a muscle. These episodes might go on for 45 minutes to an hour. Eventually, she would run out of energy and calm down to the point where she would fly up the stairs, slamming the door to her bedroom. I wouldn't dare move for a good 30 minutes in case she came back. I would then usually go out on the back porch facing the lake and sit on an old rusted metal outdoor love seat we had. I would rock back and forth, crying and trying to catch my breath, choking on my tears as the pain coursed through my body. We had a neighbor on the eastern side of the house, a kindly Polish woman, herself abused by her husband, called Mrs. Gurney. She would sometimes walk by pretending not to look, but knew very well what was happening. I was deeply embarrassed, ashamed, and in terrible pain. This went on from about the time I was 8 until I was 12. It's hard to remember too many details. Summoning up these old ghosts is very painful, obviously. Curiously, I never really blamed my mother, because I knew that she was very sick, and these fits, or whatever they were beyond her capacity to control. I saw her pretty much do the same to my sister Sheila a few times when we lived in Tampa, Florida, and to my brother Robert, surprisingly, when he was in his 20s. I don't pretend to know what it was, but I once heard Ted Bundy's description of his childhood, and I laughed, because it didn't hold a candle to what I went through. It's a miracle I survived. When I say a miracle, there was one very specific event in my life circa 1967, which I shall always believe somehow insulated me while under the control of this sadly pathetic woman, but more on that later. So this was the big secret my siblings and, of course, myself were so reticent to even think about or remember, let alone advertise in a fucking book. I'm really not sure what effect it had on me, but I was very angry and violent to my wife late into my 30s when I finally got a hold of myself, at least to the extent of not acting out. I will say, however, if there was ever a reason for a little boy to grow up and be violent and abusive, this was it. That is not to say I don't accept full responsibility for my actions. I have always been open about it and credit that partially for my ultimate reclamation. I suppose now it's more of a cautionary tale than anything. But what's done is done. I can't change it, and I have risen above it now many years ago. Whatever pain I caused others, I accept full responsibility for. However, that being said, I know well how the seed was planted. It was with great relief, then, that every summer I was shuttled off to Camp Keenan on the lake near Barker, New York, for 2 weeks of camaraderie, camping, and fun at this very well-run and even today top-notch summer camp. The first time I went was, I believe, 1962. I remember because that was the year the camp's wide-eyed, scrawny, bearded recreation director, Robert Goose Gray, fell about 30 feet out of the top of a poplar tree while hiding an artifact during a camp-wide scavenger game. I saw it happen, one of the very few, standing only about 25 feet away. The ambulance soon roared up the long drive and took him away. We didn't see him again all year. The poor guy had broken his back and almost died. Goose was an exceptionally kind, open, honest, and understanding gentleman of the finest caliber. His natural charisma and charm is well known. At the Saturday night campfires in the woods, he was a magical performer, pretending to play banjo on an old tennis racket, wearing a white pith helmet with a painted red band which had definitely seen better days. He told wonderfully engrossing stories, some of them scary, but not too much. We all sang camp songs together, which I still remember word for word. The next year, thankfully, Goose was back, a little stooped, but in fine form. Every year he led a group of young people on bicycle treks around the entire circumference of Lake Ontario, an incredible feat. He walked the Appalachian Trail alone several times, carried the Olympic torch for Lockport in the 1990s, and worked at Camp Keenan for decades and in a similar position at the YMCA on Main Street in Lockport. Goose was universally loved and deeply respected by everyone, parents and campers alike. Goose was Camp Keenan. Wonderful stories were always at the tip of his tongue, and he was always ready for a friendly game of checkers, tetherball, a long, leisurely game of fish, or an intense joint venture building bridges out of popsicle sticks in the Arts and Crafts Lodge deep in the woods. Seemingly several places at the same time, Goose was always there for whoever needed him. He was my first real role model, a truly benevolent, gentle eccentric who encapsulated a kind of natural spirituality and innocent virtue unheard of today. If you ask 100 kids who knew him the same thing, you'll get the same answer. Meeting the old gray Goose was a real game changer for just about everyone who ever came his way. On Sundays, he beautifully conducted peaceful, non-denominational church services in the small open-air lakeside cathedral at the end of the huge property. I remember Goose taught us all how to stand up straight with our shoulders trimmed and walk proudly. With a distant father and obviously unwell mother, I saw Goose as a kind of adult figure of friendship and trust, who happily invited me to hang out with him in between activities in the large vintage 1920s lodge where he bunked with the other senior counselors. I would see Goose from time to time in Lockport riding his old bicycle around town. He was a devout Christian Scientist in the very best and purest sense. He later told me he read the Bible out loud in his room for 2 hours every day. He lived at the Y for God knows how many years. There were to be many more adventures between Goose and I in later years, including our travels together in India in 1993 with my young daughter Avalon and my awkward nephew Robin. Goose would remain an important figure in my life when years later he became one of the premier artists on my fledgling label Samba Records, wherein we recorded 16 original very popular CDs, now audiobooks, all of his wonderful children's stories and songs. Almost 30 years later, they still sell well online. Other than the occasional horror at home, school too offered significant challenges. Orchid was a strictly blue-collar town in a poor, working-class, corrupt county. So there was precious little pretensions to anything remotely connected to art or culture. Although at this tender age I had no consciousness that these were to be my future areas of endeavor, both art and pretension, all of that was bubbling up inside me karmically, pushing me in the direction I was to travel in life. I should say something here about my great love for A Christmas Carol. So at the incredibly tender age of just 7, I adapted, produced, and starred in an elementary school production of the very same, which immediately labeled me as weird to the other kids. As we all know, being weird has consequences as a child, and I was often bullied and beaten up coming to and from school on the school bus. I clearly hadn't done anything to anybody. But yet, when the school bus dropped me off at the corner of Main and Ontario near Kroll Park, there would often be 2 or 3 bigger boys just waiting for me to step off so they could attempt to kick my ass. The thing is, despite being cornered, as I stepped off, they seldom caught me. The fact of the matter was I could run like hell. Later on, I excelled at the 100-yard dash, a skill I picked up running home past Sears's stand, past the terraces, finally slamming into the white picket fence around my tiny front yard. This is not to say that they were not inevitably in hot pursuit, but for some reason, they just couldn't catch me. Then there was the matter of the sport judo my mother enrolled me in very early on, which came in handy as I knew just enough self-defense to take these guys down so that I could again bolt away. Many years later, when I was doing a book signing with John Lennon's sister Julia Baird at an upmarket Buffalo bookstore in the long line of beatard autograph seekers, a big guy in a buffalo plaid jacket handed me a copy of the book Julia and I wrote together, John Lennon, my brother, for Henry Holt. "Do you remember me?" he said out of the blue. I looked up to see his craggy face, big Buddy Holly glasses, and balding profile. "No, I'm sorry I don't," I replied. "I'm Mike Cranston, from Orchid." "Mike Cranston," I said, rolling the name around, back through time and my early memories of the Orchid years. "Yes," he said, looking down at the floor uncomfortably. Suddenly the light went on. "Did you used to beat me up?" "Yes," he said, repeating the same action. "Why?" I asked him, looking straight into his eyes. He hesitated, then shuffled nervously, rubbing his hands together as if unsure how to answer. "Because you were different, I guess." "You did real good, though," he replied, and then, "I'm sorry." The truth is, I felt sorry for him, and was touched it had actually bothered him all these years. "I understand, man. I was different," I said, looking around the room at the approximately 350 people lined up to meet John Lennon's sister and secondarily get my signature on their book. "I saw in the paper you were going to be here," he continued. "I've seen you on TV, and I have a couple of your books, so anyway, I just wanted to say hello and I'm sorry." Actually, it was quite a nice moment. The guy was sweet and sincere. I told him it was great to see him, and he moved along the line to pay for his book. Of course, I understood what he was talking about. I was weird. I used to speak with an English accent around the neighborhood, especially after the Beatles happened, which is more than enough to get your ass kicked in any small town, anywhere in the anonymous underbelly of rural America. Mostly I played by myself back then, wandering in the parks and beaches, making up pop songs and singing them into the wind. or exploring places like the alleged bottomless pond near the yacht club, which was actually a kind of open-air sewer where everybody threw their garbage, old lawnmowers, you name it. But if you asked kids, this thing had no bottom and went all the way through the earth. I remember climbing up on the old Civil War statue at the entrance of the park, jumping off the 15-foot foundation walls left intact after the infamous Orchid Hotel fire, rolling down the terraces and garbage cans only to be stopped by the chain-link fence at the top of the seawall. I used to sneak into the huge cabin cruisers moored for the season down at the marina. I would also take long 5-mile walks down Lake Road towards Barker, and then in a few years hitchhike everywhere from Niagara Falls to Wilson, Lockport, and even the Hare Krishna Temple in Buffalo on Bidwell Parkway. Although I grew up in several places, if anyone ever asks, I say I'm from Orchid. Not only because it is an utterly beautiful place, but it's where I first felt the tug of spirituality, stepped into a confident state of self-consciousness, grew compassion, found forgiveness, and the first inklings of my talent, and ultimately overcame so much. My mother once planted a fairly large patch of tiger lilies on the western perimeter of our small lawn back then. I drove by about 5 years ago, and they were still there. The house was gone, and replaced by another fancier one, as it was lakeside property. Gone, too, was the sturdy maple tree in the front yard I used to climb high up into the dense branches about 50 feet above the road and drop pebbles on the people passing who were clueless as to where they came from. Even the run-down one-room cottages which surrounded our house where the factory workers from Buffalo used to come in the summer for a week or two, everything was gone. My mother's tiger lilies, however, were exactly where she put them. I was happy that there was something left. They even cut down the huge willow tree on the beach my mother insisted was the only thing holding up the embankment. I never harbored any hatred for my mother, only love. I think the things she did to me helped me grow compassion, and even now, several decades after her death, I miss her and my father often. I've seen other people close to me haunted by the past, crippled forever by that experience, cut down by the things they had to endure, but not me. Somehow I was exempt. I don't carry grudges and don't hide any traumas. I cleansed myself of my anger long ago. When I was 11, I was molested by an older, much bigger boy called Mike Ryan on several occasions. But as I had no idea at all what sex was, even that didn't really affect me. The many traumatic things I experienced, which to a greater or lesser degree took so many down with them for the rest of their lives, somewhere along the line I was exempt from carrying around the kind of neuroses I've seen so many people jealously treasure. Sometimes on overcast days, I would walk along the beach skipping stones, breaking open rocks looking for quartz crystals. One late afternoon I saw something, or at least I thought I saw something unusual at the horizon, just to the right of the broken hotel pier, once a grand promenade for the Orchid Hotel, and now a crumbling ruin, moss-covered and home to hundreds of seagulls. It was a kind of concentrated light, very bright, darting across the horizon in incomprehensible zigzag patterns. I only followed it for a moment, and then it seemed to disappear into the clouds. That is, if it was really there at all. It was now 6 o'clock. I know because of the horrific air raid siren at the Orchid Firehouse on Route 78 at the edge of town, which would explode every night at that time. Even though you knew it was coming, everybody still jumped when they heard it. Even though it happened every day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, it was impossible to get used to. Beyond that, it was time to go home. Pretty much a law for every kid in Orchid Beach. I lived through most of the 50s and all of the 60s. By the time I got to the 70s, I knew I was on my own, staring down shit like ABBA, Nixon, and the plastic, unrepentant consciousness which, like the old paint ad, covered the earth. I was desperate for something which meant something, but to no avail. I had to settle for macrame, the captain and tennille, and reluctant middle-class pussy just like everyone else. I held down a job at Sears for exactly 3 hours. It was tough even to go out of the fucking house. I tried to shoot up heroin exactly once, but missed the vein and ended up puking all over my tiny bedroom. I couldn't even be a proper junkie. At 20, I felt like I was 100. And don't listen to any bullshit about the hippies still happening any time after 1970. The music, the fashion, and even the vibes had all been co-opted by big business and were being sold back to the kids via J.C. Penney. In Tampa, all the would-be hippies used to meet nightly at Ballast Point Park. One Saturday evening, I thumbed a ride expecting to find the usual bell-bottomed troops hanging out, but there was only one lanky kid huddled against the wall of the old bait shop near the pier. It was just starting to rain. "Where is everybody?" I asked. "It's over, man," he answered flatly, looking at the ground. "What do we do now, man?" I wondered. "Whatever you want. It's every man for himself. There is no more us. America has always been a horror show, but never more so than in the 1970s. At some point in my young life, it was decided that my mother, my sister Sheila, and I should move to Tampa, Florida. My brother Robert was attending the University of Tampa, but there was some kind of scandal concerning a sexual assault by Bob of an 80-year-old man in nearby Plant Park. There are no more lurid details. That was pretty much all a 10-year-old mind, or indeed a 65-year-old one, cares to know. We lived at first in Hyde Park, just across the bridge from downtown, now very fashionable, then dirt cheap. Tampa was a homey, comfortable city where one always felt safe and people were friendly, honest, and open. I used to like deep-fried deviled crab, which wrapped in wax paper was sold on street corners and handed into the window of the car hot and spicy. A couple of times a week, my mother and I would take a ride to the milk machine, which was a huge carton of milk about 2 stories high, which dispensed a gallon of milk at a time for 40 cents. Then there was the architectural abomination, which was Kentucky Fried Chicken on Bay to Bay and Del Mabry, which was in fact another huge monolith, with an Andy Warhol-esque portrait of the Colonel and the logo, "It's finger-licking good," which, despite its size, was not the restaurant, which was adjacent, but rather an architect's useless nightmare set on the corner for decades, inviting people in to partake of Saunders' pressure-cooked chicken body bits. From the vantage of my now nearly lifelong walk with vegetarianism, it seems rather lamentable, but in those days it was a highly anticipated event to take home our chicken in that muted cardboard bucket, and along with it containers of mashed potatoes and gravy, as well as coleslaw, which I still love, plus a good slab of Floridian cornbread. People were polite in Tampa in those days. Old Florida crackers, young kids, and soulful black folks would say "yes, ma'am" and "yes, sir" in a purely non-political, folksy, sincere way, and it made you feel good. My mother, God bless her, made sure I had an active life, attending the Florida School of Judo for years, group guitar lessons at the Recreational Center at Ballast Point, taking ballroom dancing at Gay Frank Ray's studio, and otherwise preparing myself for one day becoming the gentleman I never did. Still, if Orchid showed me a glimpse of the spirituality of nature, Tampa taught me how to get on with people and extend my reach into society as a young man. I hate to think of a Tampa now filled with gangbangers, crack hoes, desolate storefronts, and exorbitant real estate prices, as in my time it was a kind of paradise for young people. I remember getting on my bike in the morning and being instructed to make sure I was home before dark. "Yes, ma'am," I would shout back at my mother as I rode away. This left me free to explore the people and the flavors of the first reasonably big city I knew. There was the implausible minarets of the University of Tampa, the old airport at the end of Del Mabry, where you could walk right up to the plane to meet your family when they flew south for a holiday. Armour's Costume House, where I used to rattle around entranced by huge papier-mâché jokers' heads, ragged gorilla costumes, Revolutionary War uniforms that had seen a better day, and of course the pirate gear they carried, which I assume was enthusiastically rented out for the yearly Gasparilla Parade celebrating the criminal exploits of one Jose Gaspar, a well-remembered pirate who used to stalk those very waters surrounding Tampa Bay back when real pirates were still a thing. I was enrolled in several schools, including Mitchell Elementary, of which I can remember 3 things. John F. Kennedy, always a personal hero of mine, drove by in his motorcade one afternoon. I was right there on the curb and felt he smiled and waved at me. Second, at school there were 2 water fountains. One said black and one white over each. I snuck into the maintenance man's room, stole a screwdriver, pried off the one that said black, twisted it up, and threw it over the fence. Finally, my mother kept me out of school for long periods of several weeks or even months at a time. The craggy-faced music teacher, on his own time, came by one afternoon, politely knocked on the door, and told my mother how much I was missed at school. She made me hide behind that very door. I think she was just too sick and depressed to get me off to school every day. There is so much I will never understand that I don't even try. I think that anyone who really had any interactions with my mother could see that she was deeply disturbed. Across from the University of Tampa was the David Falk Theater, a classical venue of which I have fond memories, both when my brother took me there to sit in the empty house and watch rehearsals for the theater major's productions, and in 1971, when I starred as Macbeth in a very reasonable adaptation of the great Scottish play. Sitting in that beautiful old theater watching rehearsals for Waiting for Godot or attending a traveling one-woman show by Agnes Moorehead, beloved of the television show Bewitched, but far more accomplished on stage and screen in earlier years. I spoke to her after the show. She was very kind. It was then the idea of becoming an actor first started to rattle around in my head. It wasn't too long after that my mother enrolled me in a theater for young people class Saturday afternoons at the university, taught by a probably not very accomplished teacher by the name of Marcel Alexander. I enjoyed the work and the attention acting offered and was pretty much sold on the dream of one day being a movie star, an unfulfilled fantasy I'd clung to right up until my early 60s. We often moved from apartment to apartment in Tampa. I have no idea why. I remember going with my mother to a pawn shop on the outer reaches of downtown Tampa and her telling me to wait at the end of the store while she did business. An old friend of mine from the Channel Islands used to say I wasn't raised, rather I was dragged up. I had no say in anything, but these constant moves necessitated school changes and therefore upheaval which kept me isolated and somewhat socially awkward. Unlike other children who endured similar socialization nightmares, I acted out, never missing an opportunity to push myself forward or make a joke given the opportunity in class. That being the case, I spent quite a lot of time standing outside class in the hall, or indeed in the cloakroom, isolated from being the class clown. I was vaguely aware around the beginning of 1966 there was an emerging youth movement, which along with the music I heard on the radio and was very attractive. By this time we had moved to a long, low, 3-bedroom house painted muted pink, which my mother purchased for just $9,000. I spent about 8 years there in all, from the age of 10 to 18, at 3703 Dale Avenue, just off Del Mabry, quite close to the 50s-style Hawaiian Inn. Around this time I was attending Madison Junior High and was considered by the more unenlightened teachers to be a bad boy, and by the cooler ones like the lovely, mini-skirted, Twiggy look-alike Anita Miles, a rather talented young man. I often think about Miss Miles. She was one of the first to see that I had talent, but beyond that she was very beautiful. Often flowers were delivered to the class by unknown admirers. Of course, we entertained all sorts of schoolboy fantasies about her. I hate to think of her now in her mid to late 70s, old and unattractive, when she was so very young, chatty, and vibrant. No such sexual fantasies were required when dealing with Mrs. Fernandez, a teacher's assistant whose family I would later come to know. I remember she wore very black high heels, red lipstick, and had wavy salt and pepper hair. She taught Spanish and was very ethnic, and she was also a pedophile. I know 2 other boys she groped in the hall. There were 3 of us altogether, and I remember now that all of us were marginalized in the sense we came from single-parent poor families. She pinned me against the wall in a long outdoor hallway and touched me one afternoon. It was not enjoyable. Then there was Mrs. Sowell, a busty, shapely math teacher with a tall brunette beehive and lots of eye makeup. One day she called me up to her desk to show me something. She took out some papers and scissors and told a little joke about what I can't remember, but the punchline was a great big hard paper dick, which popped out at me when she folded the construction paper a certain way. I thought you might like to see that. She looked me over. You can take your seat now, Geoffrey. Frankly, I didn't mind any of this. At this point in my life, I was rather thankful to be the object of anyone's attention. One day I was called into the principal's office over the loudspeakers, where I found my mother and 2 suited silent men I didn't know staring at me critically. I was certain I was in big trouble for something, but I didn't know what. The spinster headmistress, Hortense Mintz, spoke. "Sit down, Geoffrey. Your mother, myself, and these gentlemen have been discussing your future." I said nothing, but I knew this couldn't be good. "You like acting, don't you?" she continued. "Yes, ma'am," I replied. "In Tampa in the 60s, you always said yes, ma'am, or no, sir, to the grown-ups. I hope it's still that way." "You know Joe Weintraub, don't you?" Miss Mintz asked. I answered, "Yes, ma'am, I certainly did." Joe and I were friends. He was a mathematical genius driven to excel by his Jewish parents, who was picked up in a van 3 afternoons a week and taken to the University of Tampa to attend courses with the students there. "I've had reports of you showing off in class and interrupting the other students' ability to study with your constant jokes and comments. So this was it. Here it comes." I hung my head and said nothing. My mother's face was expressionless, and the men, too, were impassive. "We thought it might be a good idea if you continued your studies in acting at the university. You could ride along with Joe." "Would you like to be an actor someday, Geoffrey?" There was only one obvious answer. "Yes, ma'am." From that day on, my life changed forever. In that moment, in that room, with Miss Mintz, my mother, and the 2 men who never said a word, from then on, Joe and I were taken to the university for our prospective studies, he in the math and science department, me with the theater students. At that time, the theater department was in residence at Falk Theater, so I had a wonderful opportunity to see everything that not only passed through town in touring companies, but also the work of my now fellow students. It was a wonderful, magical time. At last, something that I could call my own, something I was really good at, something I just knew would be important to my life. It was at Madison, too, that my young life changed in other dramatic ways as well. There was an older kid called Pat, whose father was a well-known professional golfer. He didn't like me, and he used to try and knock me around at lunch. He was what they called a surfer. They wore Gant shirts, penny loafers, and khakis. He had a blonde, vaguely Beatle cut falling gently over his eyes, but the short back and sides told the tale. He was a straight, as we called them back then. Then, seemingly overnight, there was a change. He was suddenly chummy, chatty, and even fun. It was like night and day. Pat was a new man. Once again he approached me in the lunchroom. I was suitably cautious as he led me to a corridor for a private conversation. "I've got some acid. Strawberry Barrel. You want a hit?" "What's acid?" I replied seriously. "LSD, Juliana. Boy, you are dumb." Not quite as much as he thought, however, as I knew very well what LSD was, as I'd read about it in Life magazine, seen it on TV, and like every good American nerd of 13, I was scared. I don't think so. And then out of nowhere, how much is it? $4 a hit, Pat said flatly. I don't have $4, man. That's a lot of money. But if you have it in a few days, I guess I can save up my lunch money. I get 50 cents a day. Exactly why I changed horses midstream on this I will never know, but suddenly I was very interested to try this thing, whatever it was. Here you go, said Pat, smiling broadly. 50 cents now and every day until it's paid for. Okay, I said, fumbling through my pockets. Pat knew he was going to get paid. He was a big guy, and he would always be paid. No one would risk the blowback. I remember it was wrapped in a juicy fruit foil. I carefully put it in my old canvas bag between the pages of one of my textbooks. When I got home, I conspiratorially locked my bedroom door to have a look. It certainly was a handsome-looking little pill. It was pink. It was tiny, and it did indeed look exactly like a tiny little barrel. Like teeny-weeny microscopic candy. I was excited as well as frightened and wasn't sure what my next move should be. I certainly wasn't going to take it in my bedroom with my mother on the sofa watching TV and my sister sewing in our small dining room. No, this was a big deal, I could feel it, and it therefore called for a very special occasion. Now, it just so happened that there was an upcoming concert by Steppenwolf at the Fort Homer Hesterly Armory, near the university in downtown Tampa. Ironically, tickets were the same price as the acid, $4. I don't know where I got it, but somehow I did, and so I was off to see John Kay, the mysterious German born to be wild in person, with a nifty tab of what I was certain must be really good acid in my button-down top pocket. Pat told me it was 250 micrograms. But I didn't really understand what that was then or now. I arrived at the gig, and as I walked in the door, popped it into my mouth. I was to be initiated into the phantasmagoric, psychedelic, brave new world of lysergic acid to the strains of one of the most heralded bands of the day. I waited. I waited some more. Then a bit more. Maybe an hour passed, maybe less. The kids looked kind of strange, but they were happy, chatty, and full of piss and vinegar, all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, just like Pat. Whatever the hell this was I was presumably now part of, or about to be, it looked okay. Just as Steppenwolf took the stage, and John Kay came wriggling out in his signature black leather pants and sunglasses to the strains of Born to be Wild, I felt something. The first sensation was a warm, flowing electric buzz throughout my entire body. Not bad at all. This was followed by a faint but gradually growing web of neon geometric designs which covered everything with my eyes open or closed. Holy shit! The high-powered music acted as an accelerant, and although I was standing still, I felt as if I was moving at hyperspeed to the music, every power chord as a kind of karate chop to my soul. I laughed out loud at nothing and everything, just like the other kids around me. It was then I realized I was fucking tripping. Tripping with Steppenwolf and about 3,000 similarly zonked teens in what was without question thus far, with the exception of seeing that UFO when I was a kid, the most remarkable night of my young life. Almost immediately following their most premier radio-worthy hit, Steppenwolf plunged into the pusher. When the music changed, so did I, into something other, something wild, untamed, and barely human. "God damn the pusher man," he sang. The music slowed into a kind of deep harmonic mud, which oozed off the stage and into the hall, redecorating the venue with multicolored stalactites, slowly dripping blobs of pure fluorescent color from the ceiling. I was obviously out of my fucking teeny bopper skull. It was then that things began to slowly sour. Flying into the door was an angry father who plowed through the crowd looking for his teenage daughter, only to find her grooving to the music to the right of the stage. He grabbed her by the arm, flying her around, screaming, "You're coming with me." Not at all cool for anybody. Even John Kay seemed to stop singing for a good minute before everyone blew it off, and we were once again all in flight. As intense as this was, it was now patently obvious whatever was going on in the old National Guard armory was not in any way parent-friendly. The music pounded away. The liquid light show behind the band collided and flowed like whirling liquid atoms whizzing in space, and I was a seminal intergalactic part of it. Everything was connected, everything and everyone. The music was driving the experience. Frontman K was at the wheel, and we were all riding shotgun, hanging our heads out the window of the car like the family dog, tongues wagging in the salty, crushing breeze forever zonked. It was now obvious we were all in this together, and beyond that, as Paul McCartney had recently proclaimed to the BBC, I knew from this moment on I would never be the motherfucking same again, and I loved it. Before LSD, my aspirations were to be an astronaut, or possibly an FBI agent. I had a brush cut, wore camp shorts, rode around Tampa streets with my pet mouse in a wooden cage duct taped to my handlebars, along with my battery-powered transistor radio. I remember listening to songs like Summer in the City, Time of the Season, and For What It's Worth. Pretty heavy stuff for a 13-year-old dweeb. I was a weird kid, no question, and I had just become a whole hell of a lot stranger with the help of Dr. Albert Hoffman's accidental discovery of a substance which would launch at least 3,000-plus trips for me over the next 40 years and even travel surreptitiously through my DNA, landing in the bones of my 4 American children. A very mixed blessing, to be sure. A continuation of the now clearly defined objective to become the most dedicated hippie ever to erupt from the sandy soil of Tampa, Florida, circa 1967 was absolute. Along with the heady new music I was into, I was now immersed in experimenting with counterculture sacraments, LSD, mescaline, marijuana, and hashish, and which I regularly and enthusiastically imbibed. Next was my pursuit of the third manifestation of the Holy Trinity of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, which were the essential hallmarks of all aspirational hipsters. It was time to get laid. I had already chosen my target. Her name was Karen Kennard. She presented herself as an artist. She wasn't. Who was in fact a bicycle delivery girl, cycling eyeglass lenses around town for Bosch and Lomb. Karen was 32, had a very sexy, thin, white, Euro-derived body, big green eyes, and wore her hair in bright red Betty Page style. I first met her at a tiny head shop a few doors down from the Falk Theater on Kennedy Boulevard called the Turtle Tree. Through many incarnations around the city, it was every local hippie's home away from home, the only place to hang out and score whatever substance you were looking for in their cavernous black light room adjacent to the shop's checkout. One afternoon I was talking to the owner, Barb, a loquacious, funny, transplanted New Yorker, when Karen entered dressed in a micro miniskirt, Chinese peasant shoes, and the obligatory love beads around her neck. The two chatted briefly before Karen was once again on her bike cycling towards her office on the other side of the bridge downtown. "Who was that?" I inquired from Barb. "That's Karen, and she's way out of your league. What are you, about 12? "No, I'm 13. "Same difference," she laughed. Regardless of my statistical chances of success, I was smitten. I saw Karen several more times at the Turtle Tree, somehow got her address, and would wait in front of her apartment until she came home. We slowly made friends, talked, listened to records, notably Rubber Soul, I believe, and as carefully as I could, brought up the subject of a potential conjugal union at any given opportunity. This was always met with total rejection, until one night, when she told me I could sleep next to her on the floor, but nothing more. We made wild monkey love 3 times before the morning. Now, from today's vantage of all things politically correct and strictly by the book, I understand this was felonious on Karen's part. thus making me out to be some kind of victim. But I can assure you that was completely irrelevant and immaterial to me. I lost my virginity with Karen, and we sustained a relationship of sorts for more than a year. Somehow or other, my mother figured out where she lived, and one evening, around 11 o'clock, started banging on the door, calling my name, which didn't stop for an hour. The jig was up, but I didn't care, as by this time I wasn't worried if my mother approved of anything or not, and was just happy to have a goddamn girlfriend. Even Karen wasn't overly concerned, despite the age gap. I think we both thought we were in love, and that's pretty much all there was to it. Karen and I tripped together quite a bit, as one does, followed in the evening by long, sweaty lovemaking sessions. In Karen I found a kindred spirit, a gentle teacher, an advocate, and a very cool hippie chick to hang out with at a time when hanging out was fine art. Miss Kennard had a son called Victor, who was only about 3 years younger than myself, but lived primarily with his grandmother somewhere outside town. For some reason, I resented this kid and was demonstrably unkind to him, which of course I now regret, but at the time probably had much to do with jealousy or some kind of such juvenile emotion. I remember one summer Victor drove with my mother and I back up north to Orchid to spend the summer at the cottage. I missed Karen, and I resented and badgered the kid even more until he was eventually flown home by his grandmother. Returning to Tampa for school, Karen and I resumed our relationship at her new place, deep in the bowels of Hyde Park. In the middle of one particularly intense acid trip showing off, I scrambled to the top of her balcony railing, then up onto the TV antenna to sit on the roof and watch the stars. On my way back down, unfortunately, the antenna gave way, and I fell backwards at a height of about 20 feet to the ground. I had badly broken my shoulder in 3 places, as well as my wrist, which I put out to my side to catch the brunt of my fall. Had I not done so, I am told I would have most likely damaged my spine and quite possibly have become a quadriplegic. I was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital by ambulance, where I remember the doctor slapping me hard several times across the face and telling me not to fall asleep while they were setting my shoulder. 3 subsequent surgeries ensued, and when I was finally released from the hospital and back on my feet, Karen disappeared. Fucking a kid was one thing, I guess, but that young person almost killing himself in one's apartment was something quite different. My assumption is Karen was read the riot act by someone, possibly my mother, and warned off. I took it about as hard as any young guy losing his first relationship might, but it further acted favorably to propel me back into my first real love, acting. I cannot imagine how tedious it might be for the general public to read about an author's boyhood adventures in community theater, so I will not offer an extended history of my days at the Tampa Community Theater in Drew Park, except to say that here I studied and became even more convinced of my fate to be a professional film actor one day. It was an incredibly interesting and engrossing discipline for a young guy, even more so as the artistic director was one Francis Good, an old English gay guy who used to refer to himself as the la-di-da of Leamington Spa. Yes, he dropped his towel once, exposing himself to me in the dressing room. Yes, he was the first real eccentric I had ever seen, often wearing crazy hats to rehearsals and strutting around on opening nights through the lobby, dressed in extravagant paisley sports coats. The theater was an old World War II movie house, but was more like a fucking airplane hangar. Mr. Good used to sit in the back and yell, "Project!" at the actors, which may go a very long way to explaining as to why I have such a big mouth to this very day. In the spring of 1969, I finally moved out of the house and into a modest 3-bedroom home with a working hippie with the name of Peabody, who drove a Volkswagen and was a committed weekend warrior. The rent was split between the 3 of us. I do not remember the other guy, but I do remember a visitor who came by one night with the Beatles' newest album, Abbey Road. I was very impressed with this fellow with super long, straight, dirty blonde hair, John Lennon glasses, and a chiseled face. His name was James Frederick Brown, or simply Fred. He was from a poverty-stricken background, had gone to Boys Town, and was now studying at the University of South Florida, majoring in marijuana and LSD consumption. He was perhaps the longest and best friend I ever had. I still love him. Fred and I used to cycle around the city on our twin 10-speed bicycles, thinking nothing of riding 20 or 30 miles zooming around Tampa with great precision. He was a great friend with which I had many adventures, culminating in his run-down old house a few miles behind the University of South Florida in a place called Lutz. I think now we were perhaps both mutually bad influences on each other. But there was one occasion when he got me into shooting up amphetamine or crank, which he would direct at the rickety kitchen table, doing it for me as I never had any idea about how to do such things. He would inject me. I would fly high for a bit, and then retire to the sofa with almost terminal jitters, only to do it again once the rush had finally subsided. This didn't go on for too long, as I wasn't really a big fan, but I know that Fred and his brother Charlie Brown went on and on with that shit for a good while. After just a couple of weeks or so, however, I knocked it on the head. I didn't need to get that high, that hard, that quick, as I had other things to do. Jim DeGennaro, a young staff writer at the Tampa Tribune, chronicled the event. "Hare Krishna religion takes hold," the headline said. This austere, severely disciplined movement turns away from material pleasures and relies on Krishna, another name for the Lord. At 4 a.m., 2 hours before the sun rises, Geoffrey Giuliana, a devotee of the Hare Krishna consciousness movement, showers, dresses, and offers food to Krishna in the Sri Radha or temple room. An hour later, the broad-shouldered 18-year-old and 4 other Krishna people residing at 207 Woodlawn Avenue huddle together in a circle for meditation. This intense prayer session is followed by a cleaning of the temple and a breakfast of dal or vegetable soup. After the simple meal is finished, the devotees hold scripture classes and study the Bhagavad Gita as it is, translated by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, the spiritual master and founder of the Hare Krishna Movement. A lunch of breadsticks and vegetables is offered to Krishna at noon, followed by Sankirtan. During this ceremony, the devotees go door to door to preach the word of God. Dinner is taken at 6 p.m., followed by more scripture classes and 1 hour of free reading. The devotees take rest at 10 p.m. A day in the life of a Krishna person is very disciplined. Their temple is a monastery, and the devotees are monks who lead austere yet happy lives. We watch no television or movies. We don't play games, because we are deriving all of our pleasure from our devotional service to Krishna, said Juliana. But who has ever been hurt by discipline? Juliana, who has been a devotee for 3 weeks, does not have a spiritual name because he has not been initiated into the religion. He will receive his holy name when he spiritually advances in the Krishna consciousness movement and is graced by God. Another house devotee, Pushta Krishna, has been graced by God after a year in the Krishna movement. When asked what religion he belonged to before becoming a Krishna person, the 21-year-old said, "Show bottle religion. I was simply practicing religion 1 day a week and only several hours in that 1 day." In contrast, Pushta Krishna now devotes every day of the week to Krishna. The intense training involves chanting the sacred mantra, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare means the energy of the Lord, while Krishna and Rama are intimate names of the Lord. The Lord is present in his name, and everything relating to him has the same potency, Juliana said. His name, his form, his word, everything is all one. Pushta Krishna was in Dhaka during the Bangladesh uprising and believes that political strife led to the war between India and East Pakistan. Our view is that politicians are not solving the real problems in life, namely birth, death, disease, and old age, he said. No politician is himself free from these four miseries of material existence. Therefore, one must accept a higher authority of the scripture coming from the chain of disciplic succession. Krishna people disdain material pleasures that most of us are accustomed to and rely upon. They have no desire but to serve Krishna, and in turn, Krishna provides them with all they need to survive. Krishna is described as the owner and controller of everything material and spiritual. Therefore, one should only accept that quota which he requires, otherwise he is simply stealing from the Lord, Pushta Krishna said. So this Krishna consciousness movement is trying to re-educate the masses to spiritual life, recognizing God as the center of all activity. The origins of the Hare Krishna movement are from India. Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the great apostle of love of God and the father of the Sankirtan movement, advented himself in the town of Navadvip in Bengal, India. That was in February 1495 by Christian reckoning. By the will of the Lord, there was a lunar eclipse that evening. When Lord Chaitanya was born during that eclipse, the whole of India was roaring to the holy sound of Hare Krishna. In the 3 months that the Krishna people have been in Tampa, they have met with a very nice response, according to Pushta Krishna. Young devotees teach at a Krishna course at the University of South Florida, which includes instruction in authorized transcendental meditation and the study of the Bhagavad Gita as it is. Every Sunday at 4 o'clock, the Krishna people hold a free Krishna vegetarian love feast for the public. Devotees of Krishna consciousness pass through 4 orders of life. The brahmachari, or celibate student, has the option of marrying or remaining single. Celibate students live and study in the temple, known as the brahmachari ashram. If the devotee marries, he becomes a householder and is known as a grihasta. In later life, you can accept varnaprast, which is a transitional phase in which one breaks all worldly ties with friends and family. Finally, one accepts sannyasi, or the renounced order of life. The only engagement then is developing pure love of God by engaging body, mind, words, and senses exclusively to Krishna's service. The Hare Krishna people realize that their appearance sometimes draws stares and jeers from people on the street, but this cajoling is taken as another material aspect of the world which is disregarded. New devotee Juliana, before becoming a Krishna person, had shoulder-length hair. His head is now shaved except for a small sika or ponytail on the back of his head. He wears neck beads which signify his respect for Krishna and the traditional dhoti or skirt. I shaved my head for cleanliness, and because our spiritual master recommends it. And by pleasing our spiritual master, we obtain the grace of God, he said. I am trying to disassociate myself with everything material. That's why it doesn't bother me when people gawk at me, for I am just a spirit within a body anyway. According to his devotees, the spiritual master predicts that the Hare Krishna movement will turn the hippies into happies. The counterculture people are discovering every day that they cannot obtain any lasting happiness from drugs or illicit sex, Juliana said. So they are looking for something real, and God is that reality. Love is the ultimate trip, and Krishna is the fountainhead of all love. As far as my education was concerned at that time, I did about 1.5 years at Plant High School and then called it quits, as I was bored stiff. Couldn't see the point of it, so I simply gave it up. It was my mother who eventually convinced me that I should at least get a GED, which I did, and then later in 1972 enrolled at Hillsborough Community College in Tampa, Florida, at the Del Mabry campus. When I went to register, they asked me what I wanted to be. What else, I replied. A movie star. Such was the mindset of the mass of liberal arts students back in those dark days. Quite naturally, I was directed to the theater department, where I met a jolly old soul who was to become a great friend by the name of John Barry Silvano, and the college's other hippified instructor, the long-haired, charismatic Marvin Kirschman. But the most significant event in my life at that time was my meeting with a young lady from North Tampa by the name of Brenda Lee Black. I had been hauled in against my will one afternoon to work on some sets, and apparently for extra credit this young lady had come along, for what I don't know, as she had no perceptible building skills, but she looked good just hanging out. Girls, of course, were one of the main reasons guys got into theater, as you could show off and strut about, which attracted chicks, which in turn got you laid. It's a bit more than someone who was studying, say, physics. Brenda was a tall, buxom brunette with beautiful brown eyes and long, waist-length hair parted in the middle with two naughty, bleached blonde braids on either side. This, at the time, was fucking outrageous. I thought I was dating Ultraviolet. Actually, she looked very much like Ally McGraw, which was huge currency in those days. Closing the deal, in fact. Brenda was very sexy, sweet, but only moderately cool. One very big negative was that she liked the monkeys. Still, that might somehow be forgiven. At the end of the day, Brenda was pretty much the perfect hippie chick consort. Brenda moved into my tiny aquarium-filled bedroom at our crappy house on Dale Avenue, which my mother first objected to, but later embraced. As we got to know each other, Brenda opened up about her almost unspeakably tragic treatment at the hands of her demonic father, Raymond Lee Black. Since the age of 5, he had been sexually molesting her in the most unimaginably evil way. I don't think it's really fair to go into the details with Brenda now dead, and so many children and grandchildren who will one day learn about this book, but I will tell you that as a career Air Force sergeant, Black used to bring airmen from MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa to their house at 11114 North Dixon Avenue in North Tampa so they could have sex with his 12 or 13-year-old daughter while he watched. Some things in life are so terrible they are better off taking to the grave, both hers and mine. At any rate, one day I found her quietly sobbing in my room. I asked her what was up. She didn't want to tell me. At the time, we were a brand new couple, and I didn't really know anything about her background except that she was an Air Force brat and had lived all over the world, which on the surface seemed terrific. Eventually, she told me she was pregnant with her father's child. As you might imagine, I was more than stunned. All I could do was hold her close while she cried and cried. I realized her moving in with me probably had a lot more to do with her getting out of that house than being swept off her feet by me. I told her it would be okay, and the very next day, I pulled the money together and took her for an abortion. After that, nothing much was said, but I hated that man more than I've ever hated anyone in my life, and as much as I possibly could, at all times, and still do. If that motherfucker ever said anything even remotely out of line with me, I would blast him with the truth for all to hear wherever we were. I wanted to make sure that he knew, I knew, and that he had gotten away with absolutely nothing. This was all very difficult and complex for a young man of just 18 or 19, and I remember taking a long walk alone at night, wondering if I should get involved with any of this, as pretty and pleasant as Brenda was. She was obviously damaged goods, as they say in Southeast Asia, and I understood it was a risk to be too deeply involved with someone who had been through so much trauma. She was deeply vulnerable. Thus I pitied her, and she helped me make sense out of the chronically depressed atmosphere in that little pink house on Dale Avenue. I am certain that there was something which would travel through the DNA of this sweet young lady into the 4 children we had together, which contributed to their own problems later on in life. I thought about that then, and I'm certain of it now. Brenda and I had a great social life back then. It was a wonderful time as my generation was just beginning to grow up, move out of the house and get their own little places where everybody hung out, smoked dope, listened to music, and sometimes swam naked communally out in the country. That being said, Tampa, Florida was not Haight-Ashbury, and if you wanted to really be a hippie, you had to dig a little deeper. Originally, the big scene was at a place called Rolette Park, where they had Sunday jam sessions wherein famous people would inevitably drop by, like Steve Miller. Later on, we all moved to a place called the Tampa Men's Garden Club, where Jimi Hendrix played one day in the rain. I met him in the bathroom. Jimmy and I had a slash together, I'm proud to say. I do, of course, fully understand that putting things like this in a book is about as inconsequential as it comes. But when you're 19 and you're standing next to Hendrix, it's a fucking big deal. He said, "How you doing, man?" I said whatever I said, I don't remember. He had very long fingers like Robert Johnson, was cordial, down to earth, and treated everybody with respect. There was absolutely no Star Trip shit about him at all. I think everybody understands that Jimmy was always the real deal. Eventually there was a shooting over a drug deal gone bad at the Garden Club, so they closed it down. And Brenda and I wandered off to a commune at a place called Lake Echo, run by a philosophy teacher of mine called Ernie Williams. There were half a dozen small cottages by this lovely lake, which were actually perfect for yet more tripping, more smoking dope, but this time there was a pronounced spiritual element with everybody into some kind of meditation and, of course, listening to Ram Dass and reading whatever they could get their hands on by this early psychedelic prophet-turned-Hindu holy man. For those of you who are perhaps too young or may have missed him back then, here is the Wikipedia synopsis of this rather amazing gentleman. Ram Dass, born Richard Alpert on April 6, 1931, is an American spiritual teacher, former academic and clinical psychologist, and the author of many books, including the seminal 1971 book, Be Here Now. He is known for his personal and professional associations with Timothy Leary at Harvard University in the early 1960s, for his travels to India and his relationship with the Hindu guru Neem Karoli Baba, and for founding the charitable organization the Seva Foundation and the Hanuman Foundation. Ram Dass was perhaps the perfect spiritual transition from LSD to spiritual life in the early 1970s. He and I became friendly, and I would drive long distances with Brenda and our friends to see him in Gainesville, Atlanta, Miami, etc. His kitchen sink view of spirituality I later rejected for the more formal Gaudiya Vaishnava Hare Krishna view. But he was a great friend, we exchanged letters, and I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot from all of my time in Tampa. Next to Orchid, it is my second home, and above all, it is the place where I met Brenda Black, later Brenda Giuliano, and finally, Vrindarani Devi. A few words for young people. The yogic road is long, but real and welcoming. As a married couple, my wife and I lived the life of barefoot neophyte bhakti yogis all over India 30 years ago. Both of us were formal Brahmin initiates in the ancient Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya. While the yogic path is exciting and new to so many of you, there are those who have been walking this road since perhaps before many of you were born. That doesn't mean that we were greater, better, higher, or lower. Just that as incredibly fascinating as it is to adopt a Sanskrit name in place of your Western one, living an admirable, non-violent, vegan lifestyle and practicing yoga, there is nothing new under the sun. As far as being barefoot in India for several years in places like the train station in Calcutta, even the Indians were shocked. All I can tell you is I never had a problem there, or when I wore these very thin, sheer cotton clothes in the foothills of the Himalayas when everybody else was wrapped in blankets. I wish all young people well. But as my Guru Maharaj, Srila Mangal Niloy Goswami Maharaj once told me, time doesn't make saints, only old men. Quite obviously, I am no saint. My wife Vrinda and I enjoyed our walk together in this wonderful tradition, and wish all of you the same sense of satisfaction, selfless service, seva, compassion, and love our dear Vrinda and I experienced along the way. God bless us, everyone. If I were to be totally honest, I would tell you that from 1971 to 2001, my wife and I experienced what can only be described as several miracles of a supernatural nature, and even more lessons we took from the feet of the poorest and humblest of this world. I remember one day, I was on a very dirty railway platform in Bombay, dressed rather grandly as a Hindu monk, complete with a fresh rose and lotus flower garland around my neck. As I looked down, there was a very old lady, fully prostrated in front of me, touching my feet. She was dressed in rags, but she was no beggar. I was, and am, the beggar, a wolf in sheep's clothing. She so humbly submitted herself right there on that dirty, disgusting Indian train station floor. She then got up and wordlessly walked away without even brushing herself off. In that moment, I was forever changed. I knew I was a spiritual fraud. No holy man at all, or anything remotely close to it. Within this silent teaching from this anonymous old woman, I learned more about myself, my ego, and my place in the world than all of the many acid trips, untold hours of meditation, and world traveling which I had experienced. On another occasion, very early in the morning in Vrindavan, I was sitting on my balcony, and I saw a little girl of not more than 6 or 7 walking to school with her school books over her shoulder, tied in a bundle. Now this road is generally very busy, especially in the early morning, but there was absolutely no one around. As she walked, she came to an ancient large tree, which was regarded by the locals as being very spiritual, sacred, and holy. She bowed down in the dust of Vrindavan, touched the tree lightly, and silently went on. It was then I realized in India everything, the mountains, the rocks, the trees, the waters, everything is holy. And in my country, the United States of America, nothing was. With every human emotion, endeavor, and value wrapped around the almighty dollar. People often ask why I don't return to America. You may draw your own conclusions. These days my fortunes have changed much, but it reminds me of something Sri Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita. To those whom I show special favor, I take away everything they have, so that they can hope to depend only upon me. Under that criteria, the Supreme Lord must be very fond of me indeed.
End of Part 3.
I will ride the wheel, however long you feel, 10,000 years or more. I really can't be sure, you who dwell within. Extinguish all our sin, spread peace upon the land. Help us understand beyond all time and space. We live in perfect grace, subjects of your love that rain from up above. Oh my Lord, I love you so much. Your power to heal, your power to touch, you're everything I want to be, reflected in divinity. Oh my Lord, you dwell in our hearts, I feel your sweet touch, we're never apart. And every step I take that's free, I'm walking right along with thee. Perfect body, perfect life, perfect kids and perfect wife, perfect suit and must live for thee. Radhe 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 Bolo, Radhe Govinda Bolo. 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 Oh, deep blue Lord of my heart, show me your unmasked face, shining like 1,000 suns in an empty sky. O ragged soul, unleash me from the body, free me from mind, release me from the iron grip of the senses, banish me forever from this weary world. Dear Redeemer, I bow to you by the reedy river, see you in the trees, gather you in the harvest, breathe you in the morning breeze. Soul shaker, shake loose my pride, turn me upside down, drown me in your foaming tide. Lord Sri Krishna, smiling cowherd of Vrindavan, allow me entrance into your abode, but only as a speck of dust along your road, or a feather fallen from your proud peacocks, a drop of water in your ocean. Nothing grand may I be, but grand enough to live with thee. Radhe 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 Bolo, Radhe Govinda Bolo. Radhe 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 Bolo, Radhe Govinda Bolo.
What of the man that has nowhere to sleep? And what of the child who has nothing to eat? Birds have nests and foxes live. There's a family on the street and nobody cares. There's an old woman who's lost in her fears. We have food for all. Don't be too tall to help them on their way. We need food for life, so join the fight. It's just a hope away. We have food for. We have food for. We have food for all. Now and then we all need a friend. Let's work together and do what is right. Why should a child sleep out in the night? If there's a home for the free and a home for the brave, what about the aged, the cold and afraid? Can we forget them? Just throw them away. We need homes for all, the great and small. Whoever comes our way, that's what love is for. Open the door and give it all away. We need homes for. We need homes for. We
is sweet. He's drunk. He's drunk. Yeah. Thank you, sir. Oh, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Good night, sir.
Good night.
Congratulations.
Hello? Yes, this is the bridal suite here. And I'd like a wake-up call, please, for 6 a.m. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Good night.
Oh, Rebecca, I knew it was you. You tried to disguise your voice. But I knew, Rebecca, it was you. Oh, Rebecca.
Last night I dreamt that I drove down to Mandalay, jumped in the car, and drove down to Mandalay. Don't ask me why, but it had to be Mandalay. Full moon and sky, so it had to be Mandalay. What would I find there? It's fine, that voice was sliding.
Rebecca's a name. I'm so glad that you came. Come to me.
I thought Jesus God blimey, she's cold and she's slimy, but then I remembered I spoke when he had his tea.
It's a mad, mad world, you little punk. As you had to go. Oh, how I wanted so desperately to release the real you. And widen your horizons. Widen your horizons.
Morning. It's your wake-up call, 6
Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Mr. Rabbit, the world has gone astray. Yes, bless God, it spins that way. Every little soul must shine, shine, every little soul must shine. Mr. Rabbit, your ears are mighty long. Yes, bless God, they're put on wrong. Every little soul must shine, shine, every little soul must shine. Mr. Rabbit, your eyes are mighty red. Yes, bless God, I'm almost dead. Every little soul must shine, shine, every little soul must shine. In your heart. Yes, bless God, I know that part. Every little soul must shine, shine, every little soul must shine. Mr. Rabbit, heaven will not wait. Oh, yes, bless God, I see the gate. Every little soul must shine, shine, every little soul must shine. Mr. Rabbit, you've lingered here too long. Oh yes, bless God, my time is gone. Every little soul must shine, shine, every little soul must shine. so underhanded. I'm waiting here in the morning of meaningless. I am waking up to your lies. You only give back what you get. You better open your sleepy eyes. We are fading into midnight. I saw the shadows on the wall. I don't want it, but I got it. You're hiding in your world of sin. Those dark gray clouds won't let me in. Underhanded, we're sinking so fast. Underhanded, our love cannot last. Underhanded, I'm tossed, I've been crossed by heartless love. Underhanded, the rights, the wrongs, the seed is sown. Underhanded, the lies, the guys, the wonder whys. Vishnu Bhakti Prati Devi Satya Vacha Namo Namaha. Vrindayai Tulsi Devai Priyayai Kesavashaka Vishnu Bhakti Prati Devi Satya Vacha Namo Namaha. Vrinda Devi, Vrinda Devi, Vrinda Devi, Vrinda Devi. Devi, Vrinda Devi, Vrinda Devi, Vrinda Devi. Vishnu Bhakti Prati Devi Satya Vacha Namo Namaha. Vrindayai Tulsi Devai Priyayai Kesavashaka Vishnu Bhakti Prati Devi Satya Vacha Namo Namaha. Bhakti Devi, Bhakti Devi, Bhakti Devi, Bhakti Devi. Bhakti Devi. Bhakti Devi. Bhakti Devi, Bhakti Devi. Gazing over the ocean of careless words that have come between us, I stand alone. How can I tell you how much you really mean to me, or ever ask you to forgive? All I can say is I love you, and always hold you deep in my heart. Vrinda Devi, you are my savior. Thus I ever bow down to you with folded hands. O divine mistress of Vrindavan. O goddess, the Munis, Siddhas, Gandharvas, the Naga kings in Patala, and the great demigods sing your glories. Even though they have counted many millions of your virtues, the demigods, except for Lord Keshava, do not understand the full extent of your powers and glories. Born from Lord Krishna's bliss as he churned the milk ocean, Tulsi was carried by Lord Vishnu on his head. O Tulsi, I offer obeisances to you. When you are placed on Lord Vishnu's limbs, you purify everyone. As with your leaves I worship Lord Hari, please remove the obstacles before me. I take shelter of you. To bring auspiciousness to the world and to benefit the gopis, Lord Krishna planted you and cared for you on the shore of the Gomati River. To bring opulence to Gokul and to become able to kill Kamsa, Lord Vishnu served you in Vrindavan. O you who are dear to the worlds, in order to become able to kill the Rakshasas, Lord Ram planted you on the shore of Sarayu. Planting you is like performing great austerities. To you, O Tulsi, I offer my respectful obeisances. When in the grove of the Ashoka trees, Sita Devi was separated from Lord Ram. She meditated on you, and for this reason, she attained the company of her beloved. To attain Lord Shiva, Parvati planted you, O goddess, in the Himalayas. To you, O Tulsi, I offer my respectful obeisances. You are served by the Pitas in the Dharmaranya forest of Gaya. You, O sacred Tulsi, are served by they who desire auspiciousness. O Tulsi, you were planted by Lord Ram, served by Lakshman, and with great devotion protected by Sita Devi in the Dandaka forest. As the Ganges, which flows through the three worlds, is glorified in the Shastras, so Tulsi Devi is seen by the moving and unmoving creatures. Vishnu Bhakti Prade Devi Satya Vacha Namo Namaha. Vrindayai Tulasi Devai Priyayai Keshavashaka Vishnu Bhakti Prade Devi Satya Vacha Namo Namaha. Tulsi Devi, Tulsi Devi. Tulsi Devi, Tulsi Devi. Tulsi Devi, Tulsi Devi. Tulsi Devi, Tulsi Devi. let me die. You seem so afraid, I've seen the look in your eye. Please let me go, I've nothing to say. You've opened the door, now show me the way. Fly away home, never look back. Leave life behind and let love advance. And all the time we knew that all we had was lost. We lived our lives, but darling, oh, at such a cost. I look behind and think of all the friends I've left. Fences never mend, people seldom bend, words I never meant. Take me back again, oh, take me back again. A world without end, with nowhere to be. Tear back the veil, set yourself free. You're part of it all, now simply be. Fly away home. 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 Fly away
We hope you've enjoyed this Icon audio presentation. Icon Audio Arts. Thank you for listening.